The warning we chose not to hear did not come with flashing lights or booming voices across the sky. It came in the form of silence interrupted by a signal, in the form of an object racing through space, in the form of data lines that most dismissed as noise. The danger was never that the signal would destroy us outright, but that we would fail to recognize it for what it was. Humanity has always balanced between two states of mind when it comes to the cosmos: the security of scientific certainty and the unease of cosmic paranoia. Somewhere between those two, truth often hides, and in the case of Three-Eye Atlas, the truth may not be about what it is, but about what we refuse to acknowledge when it arrived. The central theme of this story is not impact risk or orbital mechanics. It is about warnings, the ones whispered in radio static in 1977, the ones embedded in the trajectories of objects that pass through our skies, the ones carried in chemical signatures that do not line up with natural expectations, and most importantly, the warning that even now might still be echoing, waiting for us to finally understand. The story begins with signals. In August of 1977, a strong narrowband radio signal was detected by Ohio State's Big Ear radio telescope. The printout captured intensity values so remarkable that astronomer Jerry Omen famously circled them and wrote "Wow" in red ink. For decades, that exclamation has haunted SETI researchers because no natural explanation has ever fully accounted for it. The frequency was near 1420 megahertz, close to the hydrogen line, a natural frequency thought to be a logical beacon for interstellar communication. The signal lasted for 72 seconds and then vanished. No repeat ever came. To skeptics, it was simply an anomaly, a product of chance, interference, or unrepeatable conditions. To others, it was something more, a message that we received, logged, and then quietly filed away without ever deciphering. The wow signal was never followed up with the urgency one might expect if humanity truly believed it had been contacted. Instead, years of debate diluted its significance. Reports were written, alternative explanations proposed, and eventually the anomaly was left in that vague category scientists call unresolved. Yet the implication remained, unresolved as well. If a civilization had wanted to whisper across the void, the wow signal would have been the perfect test. Strong enough to be noticed, brief enough to be dismissed, located at a frequency we associate with universality, and appearing at a time when humanity's radio telescopes were just barely capable of hearing it. That is not proof, but it is a pattern. A pattern that became clearer once interstellar objects began to arrive. In 2017, Oumuamua entered the solar system. It came in fast, hyperbolic, unbound by the sun's gravity. Its brightness varied in ways suggesting an elongated shape, unlike most comets or asteroids, and it accelerated slightly, not in a way that suggested propulsion, but in a way that puzzled researchers who expected a simple gravitational path, radiation pressure, outgassing, or something else. The scientific consensus landed on natural explanations, though each came with caveats. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist, argued that Oumuamua might be artificial, a fragment of technology, perhaps a probe. His claim stirred controversy, but again the pattern appeared, an object that could be natural, yet contained anomalies subtle enough to spark questions about intention. A visitor dismissed, studied, and filed away much like the wow signal decades earlier. Then came 2-Eye Borisov in 2019. Unlike Oumuamua, Borisov looked more like a typical comet. It displayed outgassing, a coma, a tail, all the signatures one would expect. For that reason, it reassured many. Here was an interstellar object that fit within the known boundaries of cometary science. But even then, its chemistry told a different story. It carried high levels of carbon monoxide, unusual even among solar system comets. Once again, there was nothing to prove intention, nothing that violated physics, but enough to suggest conditions that did not align with our local expectations. It too passed, and like its predecessor it was catalogued, discussed, and then left to fade into memory. By the time Atlas was detected in 2025, humanity already had a framework in place. Interstellar objects exist. They are rare but real. They enter, they pass, and they leave. But Atlas carried more weight than the others. Its speed was extraordinary, almost twice that of Oumuamua. Its chemistry was stranger still, with carbon dioxide dominating in ratios never observed before. Its likely origin in the galactic thick disk meant that this object might be older than our entire solar system. Atlas was not merely another interstellar visitor, it was a messenger from deep galactic history. But if we frame Atlas as a warning, we must confront the idea that it was not an isolated event. It was part of a sequence. Signals in the static, visitors at intervals, anomalies that align more like punctuation marks in a sentence than random chance. The warning we ignored lies not in any single one of these data points, but in the refusal to connect them. Each time, science had an explanation that sufficed. The wow signal, interference. Oumuamua, outgassing. Borisov, exotic comet chemistry. Atlas, another comet, albeit unusual. Each explanation removed urgency, diffused speculation, and reassured the public. But at what cost? If a pattern were unfolding before us, we would never see it, because our methods are designed to isolate anomalies, not connect them. What if the signal of 1977 was not an isolated event, but an opening line? What if the interstellar visitors were chapters in a message written across centuries? What if Atlas itself was not just a comet, but the culmination of a warning sequence, one designed to test whether we are capable of recognition? To ask these questions is to step into uncomfortable territory, because the safest position is to assume coincidence. A single, unexplained signal? Coincidence. A strange acceleration in a visitor? Coincidence. Unusual chemistry in another? Coincidence. Ancient origin and chemical oddities in Atlas? Coincidence. But when coincidence piles upon coincidence, patterns emerge. The wow signal appeared near the hydrogen line, the frequency most likely to be used for interstellar communication. Oumuamua arrived just decades later, the first known interstellar object, as if to show us the physical counterpart to the earlier whisper. Borisov came next, reassuring us with its comet-like appearance, but still carrying unusual chemistry. And Atlas followed, faster, older, stranger, as though the message had grown bolder. To ignore this progression is to insist that nature not only surprises us, but does so in ways that mimic intention. The speculative tension here is unavoidable. On one side, science insists on natural explanations. On the other, paranoia whispers of intelligence. Both sides acknowledge the anomalies, but only one considers the possibility that they form a coherent signal. And in that space between certainty and suspicion lies the warning. It is not about what Atlas could do physically. Its trajectory poses no danger to Earth. It is about what Atlas represents symbolically, a moment when all the pieces of a decades-long puzzle aligned and humanity looked away, insisting the picture was incomplete. Consider the timing. The wow signal in 1977. 40 years later, Oumuamua. 2 years after that, Borisov. Then just 6 years later, Atlas. Each event closer together, each anomaly more striking. In human timescales, that is acceleration. In cosmic terms, it is immediate. If this were a conversation, the tempo would be quickening, the pauses shrinking, the emphasis growing, yet our responses remain the same. Cautious dismissal, unwillingness to cross the boundary from possibility into recognition. Atlas, with its carbon dioxide dominance, may not be dangerous in the physical sense. But what if that chemical profile is not just a product of distant formation, but a marker, a code? When we study exoplanet atmospheres, we look for biosignatures, oxygen, methane, ratios that suggest life. Why would we assume that interstellar visitors cannot also carry such signatures, deliberately arranged? The numbers are odd enough to force explanation, and yet our explanations focus on natural processes, however strained, because the alternative demands we ask harder questions. Who would send such a message? Why would it come in this form? And what exactly are we being warned about? The cost of ignoring signals is not measured in impacts or disasters. It is measured in ignorance. If we are being tested, not for survival, but for awareness, then failure is not about destruction, but about irrelevance. Civilizations that cannot connect the dots, that cannot recognize the difference between coincidence and communication, are civilizations that will be bypassed. If Atlas is a warning, it may not be one we can ever decode fully, but the choice to treat it as merely another comet, to archive it alongside its predecessors and move on, ensures that whatever the warning was meant to achieve, we did not hear it. And yet, the story does not end with Atlas passing. Warnings ignored do not vanish. They accumulate, lingering in archives in memory, in the quiet static of recorded data. They wait for recognition. The wow signal still sits in our records. Oumuamua's trajectory remains mapped. Borisov's chemistry is still logged. Atlas's spectra will remain in our archives long after the object itself has returned to interstellar darkness. The pieces are all there, waiting. The question is whether we will finally assemble them, or whether we will continue to insist that the pattern does not exist. The warning we ignored is not a singular event, but a thread woven through decades of discovery. A thread we keep pulling at without ever admitting it is connected to something larger. Tonight, we follow that thread deeper, into the echoes of 1977, into the anomalies of interstellar visitors, into the chemistry that refuses to fit, and into the possibility that the greatest danger we face is not from the cosmos itself, but from our own refusal to listen. The first whisper in the static was not the wow signal. That one is remembered because it was dramatic, logged and circled with red ink. But before the famous exclamation, there had already been smaller hints, moments when the universe seemed to speak in ways we weren't yet equipped to understand. Radio astronomy was still young in the 1960s and 70s, still defining its boundaries, still unsure of what it was truly hearing. The cosmos is never silent. Stars, pulsars, quasars, galaxies all pour energy across the spectrum. The challenge was never about whether signals exist, but about which ones matter. Somewhere in the constant hum, the first whisper arrived, faint enough to be dismissed, persistent enough to leave unease behind. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, officially began in 1960 with Project Ozma. Frank Drake pointed a radio telescope toward two nearby sun-like stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, and listened. For weeks the instruments captured static. Then, at one point, there was a signal. Narrowband, strong, seemingly artificial. For a moment, excitement surged, but investigation revealed the source to be a high-flying aircraft. A false alarm. Still, the effect was lasting. Scientists had tasted the possibility. They had experienced the disorienting thrill of what might have been, and that taste made every later anomaly harder to dismiss, even when evidence leaned toward mundane explanations. Through the following years, other whispers emerged. Some were bursts of narrowband noise that appeared and vanished too quickly to analyse. Others were repeating signals later traced to pulsars, celestial lighthouses spinning with mechanical precision. When pulsars were first discovered in 1967, they were so regular that the team nicknamed them LGM, short for Little Green Men. That label was half joke, half nervous speculation. Nobody truly believed they had discovered alien beacons, but the whisper in the static was strong enough that the possibility had to be entertained. Eventually, pulsars were explained as rotating neutron stars, natural but extraordinary. The lesson was that the universe could mimic intention without ever involving intelligence. That lesson shaped SETI's cautious culture, a culture that would later be tested when a more compelling signal appeared. By 1977, SETI experiments had become routine. Radio telescopes around the world occasionally pointed at promising stars, collecting data that mostly yielded nothing beyond the expected cosmic background. The Big Ear telescope in Ohio was part of this growing network, scanning the skies for signals near the hydrogen line at 1420 MHz, a frequency long considered ideal for interstellar communication. Hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. A message sent on its wavelength would be universally significant, unlikely to be mistaken for random noise. The scientists were not expecting miracles, but they were listening. On August 15th of that year, the Big Ear registered something unusual, a sharp spike in intensity across exactly that frequency range, lasting 72 seconds, the length of time the telescope could track a single patch of sky. It was strong, narrowband and clean, with none of the hallmarks of terrestrial interference. Jerry Amon circled the sequence of numbers and letters that recorded the signal strength, writing "Wow" in the margin. That annotation transformed an anomaly into legend. The whisper had become a shout. But what made the wow signal haunting was not only its intensity, it was the silence that followed. No repeat was ever detected, despite repeated attempts to observe the same coordinates. If it was a transmission, it was either brief by design or directed from a source that never aimed at us again. If it was natural, it was an event so unusual that it has never recurred in decades of observation. Either possibility carried weight, but neither offered closure. The whisper remained unresolved. The first whisper in the static, then, was not just about what was heard, but about how humanity responded. Scientists documented it, analysed it, and debated it. Some leaned toward terrestrial explanations, perhaps a reflection of a signal from Earth, bouncing off space debris or a satellite. Others argued that the characteristics did not fit interference. Over time, the scientific consensus landed in the middle. Interesting, unexplained, but not evidence of extraterrestrials. That cautious conclusion was necessary to preserve credibility, but it also meant that the whisper was effectively ignored. The warning we ignored is visible in that response. Humanity had encountered a signal that perfectly fit the criteria for interstellar communication, and the result was hesitation. Not because the data was weak, it wasn't, but because the implications were too strong. To treat it as a genuine message would have demanded new protocols, new international agreements, new risks. It was safer to set it aside, and that decision, whether justified or not, set the tone for everything that followed. Decades later, when Oumuamua arrived, the echoes of the WOW signal resurfaced. Avi Loeb and others who suggested artificial origin were treated as outliers, much as those who had taken the WOW signal seriously were treated decades earlier. The pattern repeated, anomalies appear, excitement surges, explanations dilute, consensus settles, and the warning is ignored. The first whisper in the static was not just the wow signal itself, but the human pattern of dismissal. What makes this pattern significant is not the scientific caution itself, which is necessary, but the failure to connect events across time. The wow signal, Oumuamua, Borisov, Atlas, each treated in isolation, each explained away individually but rarely considered together. If intelligence wanted to test us, to see whether we could recognize a sequence, this is exactly how it would appear. Not as a single undeniable contact, but as a trail of anomalies, subtle enough to leave doubt, persistent enough to reveal a pattern. The whisper in the static, therefore, is not one event but a series. Each time we heard it, we convinced ourselves it was nothing. Each time, we closed the case prematurely. And each time, the universe may have been waiting to see if we would finally listen. It is worth considering how human psychology plays into this. The scientific method demands skepticism, demands evidence, demands that extraordinary claims be met with extraordinary proof. that is rational. But human cognition is also influenced by fear, by reputation, by the desire to avoid ridicule. Astronomers who saw the WOW signal and entertained the possibility of alien origin were careful not to overstate it. Their careers depended on restraint. Loeb's insistence on considering Oumuamua artificial was met with criticism partly because it challenged the culture of caution. To suggest intelligence is to risk credibility, and so most remain silent. The first whisper in the static, then, was not just cosmic. It was internal. It was the tension between what the data suggested and what scientists were willing to say. Imagine for a moment that the WOW signal had repeated daily, weekly, predictably. Imagine that it had persisted long enough to remove doubt. The world would have changed overnight. Governments would have convened emergency sessions. Religions would have rewritten doctrines. Humanity would have been forced to acknowledge it was not alone. But that did not happen. The whisper came once and then vanished. That absence of repetition gave us permission to ignore it. But what if that was the point? What if the real test was not whether the signal repeated, but whether we cared enough to keep listening anyway? The whisper was faint, but it carried implications louder than any shout. It suggested that intelligence might not arrive in forms we expect. It suggested that messages might not be repeated for convenience. It suggested that if we cannot recognize subtlety, we might not be ready for clarity. And as decades passed, we continue to encounter anomalies that force the same choice: engage with the possibility or retreat into comfort. Atlas, when it arrived, carried that same whisper, but on a different channel. This time it was not radiostatic, but chemical signatures and orbital mechanics. A message written in velocity, in eccentricity, in ratios of carbon dioxide to water. Just as the WOW signal fit the criteria of an interstellar message, Atlas fit the criteria of an interstellar messenger. But once again, the pattern was treated as coincidence. Once again, the whisper was ignored. The first whisper in the static teaches us that warnings do not come with clarity. They come with ambiguity, with plausible deniability, with enough uncertainty that we can choose not to act. That is both the mercy and the danger of such messages. They do not force us into panic, but they test whether we are capable of connecting dots without being forced. If the WOW signal had been the opening line, Oumuamua II, Borisov III and Atlas IV, then the sequence is clear enough to those who are willing to see. But clarity is not the same as proof, and proof is what science demands. And so, we remain caught between two modes of thought: certainty that reassures us, and paranoia that unsettles us. Somewhere between those two lies recognition. The whisper continues to echo, not in the sky, but in our records, our debates, our unresolved anomalies. It is the sound of a question left unanswered, of data that refuses to conform, of warnings we continue not to hear. And as we move forward into the story of Atlas, into its speed, its chemistry, its implications, that first whisper remains the context. The warning we ignored did not begin in 2025. It began decades earlier, in the static of 1977, and perhaps even before. The rest is simply us failing to recognise how loud the whisper has become. 1977 has become a year remembered not for what was said, but for what was heard once and then never again. The WOW signal has been repeated in documentaries, books, late-night discussions and skeptical dismissals, but at its core it remains something very simple. A moment when the universe produced a sound we could not easily explain, a whisper loud enough to stand out against the endless hum of radio noise. It was a whisper that looked like a message, acted like a message, but never repeated itself the way a message should. That contradiction has left it suspended in a strange space between mystery and irrelevance. Yet if the story of Atlas is to be understood, if the idea of a warning ignored is to be taken seriously, then this event in 1977 cannot be treated as an isolated curiosity. It is the foundation. The Big Ear radio telescope near Delaware, Ohio, was not a spectacular machine by the standards of space exploration. It was not massive like Arecibo, not modern like Green Bank, not even particularly sophisticated in design. But it was steady, functional, and part of an era when radio telescopes were becoming the ears of astronomy. Its work was straightforward: listen to narrow-band radio frequencies and record intensity values. Hydrogen was the target, because hydrogen is everywhere. The 1420 MHz line is the natural broadcast frequency of the universe, and if anyone out there were trying to be heard, that would be the logical place to speak. On August 15th, 1977, a line of numbers appeared on the Big Ear's computer printout. A 6, then an E, then other high values, representing a spike in signal strength far beyond the background. It lasted 72 seconds, the maximum length that the telescope could hold a patch of sky as the Earth rotated beneath it. The format was routine. The machine translated signal strength into alphanumeric characters, with higher numbers or letters representing stronger intensity. But the sequence was anything but routine. It was so strong, so clean, so narrowband, that when astronomer Jerry Eman reviewed the printout days later, he circled the string and scrawled a single word in the margin. Wow. That annotation, impulsive and human, is the reason we still talk about it today. The wow signal was compelling because it looked exactly like what SETI researchers were hoping for. It was not broadband, which would suggest natural static. It was not noisy or scattered. It was sharp, precise, confined to a very specific frequency. It came from a region of the sky near the constellation Sagittarius, not obviously tied to any nearby star, not obviously terrestrial in origin. And crucially, it did not immediately repeat. If it had been interference from Earth, one might expect it to recur, to appear again in later scans. But it didn't. It appeared once, in one 72-second window, and then vanished forever. What makes 1977 so important is not simply that the signal was detected, but how humanity responded. In the immediate aftermath, researchers scrambled to check the coordinates again. They pointed Big Ear and other telescopes at the same region, hoping for a repeat. Nothing. The silence after the signal was deafening. For those who believed it was evidence of a deliberate choice, perhaps a beacon switched off once it was sure it had been heard. For skeptics, it was evidence of an anomaly, random chance producing something that looked artificial but wasn't. That divide became permanent. Over the years, explanations were proposed. Some argued that the signal might have come from a reflection of Earth-based transmissions bouncing off space junk or satellites. Others suggested that it was a natural emission from a comet passing through the region, releasing hydrogen at just the right frequency. Still others admitted that no natural explanation fully accounted for it, but insisted that without repetition, no extraordinary claim could be justified. And so, the signal became a ghost in the archives, a conversation piece rather than a dataset, a curiosity rather than a conclusion. But the wow signal matters because of the precedent it set. It demonstrated that humanity could encounter something that fits the profile of contact and still choose not to treat it as such. The logic was clear enough. Science cannot build theories on one-off events. Data needs replication, patterns, reproducibility. But in practice, the consequence was that the most promising candidate for interstellar communication was sidelined. The warning embedded in that decision was subtle. Even if intelligence tried to speak to us, we might not recognize it unless it spoke on our terms, in ways convenient to our methods. And what if that is not how the universe works? Think of the timing. The late 1970s were years when SETI was still young, when space exploration was just beginning to find its rhythm. Voyager had only recently launched. Humanity had not yet seen close-up images of the outer planets. The search for exoplanets was decades away. In that context, a signal from the stars would have been overwhelming. Governments might not have known how to respond. The public might have spiraled into fear or fascination. Religions might have struggled to interpret it. Perhaps, then, the silence that followed was not an accident. Perhaps the whisper was deliberate, a test of curiosity, a single ping sent across the void to see if we cared enough to keep listening. The wow signal has been analysed countless times since. The raw data still exists. The exact coordinates have been checked with modern instruments. Some researchers continue to argue for natural origins, pointing to hydrogen emissions from comets or interstellar clouds. Others insist that those explanations don't hold up under scrutiny. But the truth is, no consensus has ever been reached. It remains unexplained, and that unresolved status is precisely what makes it relevant to Atlas. Because when Atlas arrived decades later, carrying its own set of anomalies, we repeated the same behaviour. We analysed, debated, dismissed, and moved on. The pattern was already established in 1977. The signal itself has a psychological weight far beyond its data. The circled wow has become iconic, a symbol of how close we may have come to contact. But the real significance is not in the exclamation, but in the silence that followed. The 72 seconds are not the whole story. The decades of nothingness afterward are. That absence has been louder than the signal itself. And in that absence, humanity demonstrated its default approach. Unless forced, we will not act. Unless undeniable, we will not believe. That reluctance is understandable, but it is also dangerous if the universe does not operate according to our thresholds of proof. Imagine for a moment that the wow signal was not random, not natural, but deliberate. Imagine that it was the first note in a sequence meant to unfold over centuries, each note arriving in a different form. A radio burst in 1977, an elongated object in 2017, a more traditional comet in 2019, a chemically impossible visitor in 2025. If that sequence were real, then the wow signal would be the opening statement, the one we failed to take seriously, and everything that followed would be part of a warning we never recognised because we had already chosen not to hear it. 1977 was a turning point not because of what was proven, but because of what was ignored. The wow signal taught us that extraordinary anomalies can be filed away, that scientific culture can neutralise even the most provocative evidence, and that humanity's threshold for recognition is far higher than a single event can reach. That lesson shaped everything that followed. By the time Atlas arrived, the story was already written. We had already demonstrated that we would not see patterns, that we would not connect dots, that we would always choose the comfort of explanation over the discomfort of possibility. And yet, the wow signal endures. It endures in the archives, in the debates, in the way it still comes up whenever interstellar anomalies are discussed. It endures because it represents the simplest version of the warning, a single, unmistakable spike in the data, a whisper in the static that looked like intention. It endures because even now, nearly half a century later, no one can say with certainty what it was. It endures because it reminds us that we may already have received the first call and chosen not to answer. Atlas did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a context shaped by 1977, by the wow signal, by the precedent of ignoring anomalies that did not fit comfortably into natural explanations. To understand Atlas is to understand that context, to see it as part of a sequence rather than an isolated event, to recognise that warnings do not always repeat themselves, and that the first whisper we chose not to hear may have been the most important of all. The most haunting part of the wow signal was not the numbers on the page or the red ink that made them famous. It was the silence that followed. 72 seconds of intensity gave way to nothingness, and that absence became more unsettling than the event itself. If the signal had repeated, if it had been regular, predictable, if it had returned again and again, then science could have studied it, confirmed it, elevated it to evidence. Instead, silence became the dominant feature, and silence is harder to interpret. Was it an accident? Was it interference? Was it a deliberate one-time transmission meant to test our curiosity? The lack of repetition created space for doubt, and in that space, the warning was lost. After August 15, 1977, teams returned to the coordinates, scanning the same region of sky for days, weeks, even years. The Big Ear listened again, and other telescopes joined in. The expectation was that if the signal had been real, if it had been intentional, it should happen again. But the sky remained empty. No spike appeared, no narrowband intensity, no echo of the original. The silence was overwhelming because it forced a decision. Without repetition, scientists could not justify treating it as evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. Without evidence, they could not push for resources, could not push for global recognition, could not risk credibility. And so, the wow signal faded. Not because it was explained, but because it was alone. That silence became the shield skeptics used to contain the anomaly. Interference, they said, would not repeat in the same way. Random natural phenomena might flare once and then vanish. Without a second event, the safest conclusion was that the signal was nothing more than an unexplained blip. The danger of this reasoning is that it assumes intelligence would communicate on our terms, that it would be patient enough to repeat endlessly, predictable enough to conform to scientific standards, persistent enough to fit into our methodology. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if intelligence does not care about repetition? What if the point was never to broadcast endlessly, but to be heard once and then leave us with the burden of curiosity? The silence after the wow signal was not empty. It was filled with speculation, with unease, with the weight of possibilities. Some argued that the signal might have been a beacon that swept past us as part of a rotating transmission, a lighthouse beam in space that we caught for just one pass. Others suggested it might have been a probe, broadcasting briefly before moving on. Still others believed it was intentional, a test to see how humanity would respond. In each of these interpretations, the silence mattered more than the sound. The absence was the message. If so, the message was clear. We were given enough to notice, but not enough to be certain. This is where the concept of warnings becomes crucial. A warning does not have to be repeated endlessly to be effective. It only has to be given once, loudly enough that those who are paying attention cannot ignore it. The wow signal was loud enough. It matched the criteria of an artificial transmission, it stood out in the data, and it was recognized as extraordinary. Yet because it was not repeated, it was ignored. Silence in this case did not reduce its importance. It amplified it. The silence that followed said more about us than about the source. It revealed our dependence on repetition, our reluctance to act on single anomalies, our tendency to dismiss the extraordinary unless it conforms to expectations. When we look back now, the silence seems less like a void and more like a deliberate choice. If the wow signal was a transmission, then the lack of follow-up could have been intentional. To give one clear burst and then nothing more forces the receiver to decide whether it matters. It tests persistence. It tests interpretation. It tests whether the receiver can see significance without being guided. In other words, the silence may have been the warning itself, a way of saying, we spoke once, and if you cannot recognize it, you are not ready for what comes next. This interpretation is speculative, of course. Science cannot confirm intention without evidence. But speculation has value when anomalies repeat across decades. Because the silence of 1977 did not remain isolated. It echoed in later events. Oumuamua's silence was physical, not radio, but it carried the same effect. A strange acceleration, a strange shape, and then it was gone, leaving only data. Borisov's silence was chemical, a strange ratio that did not repeat, that did not fit, but passed by quickly enough to resist full study. Atlas's silence was more subtle, carried in its speed, its age, its chemistry, and its refusal to linger long enough for detailed analysis. Each one echoed the same structure as the wow signal. A burst of anomaly followed by silence. Enough to notice, never enough to confirm. The silence meant too much because it shaped how we treat anomalies. In science, silence often becomes erasure. A one-time event is filed as unresolved, not evidence. A lack of repetition is equated with lack of significance. But warnings do not work that way. A warning does not need to repeat if it has already been delivered. A siren only has to sound once to change behaviour. A signal only has to flash once to redirect attention. The wow signal was that siren. And yet, we treated it as if silence erased its weight. We convinced ourselves that absence meant insignificance. In doing so, we may have ignored the most important warning humanity has ever received. Silence also creates fear, even when unacknowledged. For decades, the wow signal has hovered over SETI as both an achievement and a frustration. It is used as evidence that listening matters, proof that extraordinary events can happen, but it is also a reminder of failure. A reminder that when something extraordinary did happen, humanity was not ready to respond. The silence afterward was not just cosmic, it was cultural. Governments did not convene emergency councils. The public was not prepared for confirmation. The scientific community was not willing to risk its credibility. In that silence, humanity revealed itself as cautious, hesitant, and perhaps unprepared for contact. If intelligence exists elsewhere, if it is watching, if it is capable of sending signals across the void, then the silence of 1977 may have told it everything it needed to know. That we could hear but not act. That we could notice but not believe. That we could whisper wow and then move on. If that was the test, then we failed it. And if Atlas was the continuation of that test, then the silence of 1977 may have been the prelude to everything that followed. But silence is not only a test, it is also a strategy. Intelligence that broadcasts endlessly risks detection by unwanted parties, risks revealing itself to those it does not wish to engage. A brief burst, however, offers selectivity. It ensures that only those who are listening at the right time, in the right place, with the right equipment will hear. That kind of targeted communication is safer, more controlled, more deliberate. The wow signal fits that strategy perfectly. A short burst, detectable only once, directed at a species just beginning to listen. The silence afterward could simply mean the test was over, the message delivered, the observation complete. For us, though, the silence meant indecision. It meant endless debate without resolution. It meant caution overtook curiosity, and that hesitation has echoed in every anomaly since. When Oumuamua accelerated in ways we could not explain, silence allowed skeptics to dismiss it as natural. When Borisov carried chemistry that puzzled us, silence allowed us to file it under outliers. When Atlas arrived with its extraordinary speed and strange composition, silence allowed us to treat it as coincidence. The silence of 1977 trained us to ignore. That is why it mattered so much. It is easy to imagine that if the wow signal had repeated, if it had returned night after night, there would be no debate today. Humanity would have been forced to accept that it was not alone. Protocols would have been written, resources committed, societies transformed. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the real test was simpler. To see whether we could hear once and still care. To see whether we could take one anomaly seriously enough to reshape our approach. To see whether silence could still speak. The silence that followed the wow signal continues to echo. Not just in our archives, but in our collective imagination. It has become the template for how we handle the extraordinary. Intense interest followed by dismissal. Fascination followed by forgetting. Atlas entered that template the same way, noticed and then neutralized. But if we see these not as isolated events, but as parts of a sequence, then the silence means something else entirely. It means the message has been given. It means the warning has already been delivered. It means that our choice to ignore it is not about the cosmos, but about us. When we talk about the wow signal, we treat it as if it were a solitary voice in the night, one unique moment that has never been repeated. But the truth is that radio astronomy has always been littered with echoes, strange bursts, unexplained spikes, brief anomalies that flare and then fade. Most of them are forgotten, buried in old printouts, digital archives or data logs that no one revisits. They are labelled as interference, filed under unknown, or left unclassified. They are the forgotten echoes in the sky, whispers that came and went while we were distracted, pieces of a puzzle that might have formed a clearer picture if only they had been assembled together. The cosmos is full of signals. Pulsars tick with clockwork precision, quasars blaze with energies that dwarf entire galaxies, magnetars release sudden bursts of radiation that can flood detectors with noise. To most astronomers, these are natural phenomena, well understood and expected. But mixed into that endless hum are signals that don't fit. Too narrow, too sharp, too precise. Sometimes they are caught once and never again. Sometimes they appear sporadically, teasing with irregularity. Each one on its own may not be enough to challenge consensus, but together they form a background of anomalies that we have trained ourselves not to notice. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as radio telescopes became more sensitive, unexplained bursts were occasionally recorded. Most were attributed to interference from Earth, airplanes, satellites, even microwaves leaking into the equipment. Others were simply unexplained, set aside because they did not recur. The wow signal stands out because it was strong, clear, and famously labelled. But it was not the only whisper. There were other moments, other echoes, weaker or shorter, that never became famous because no one circled them with red ink. They were anomalies that could have pointed to something larger, but instead they were forgotten, reduced to lines in data sheets that no one reads anymore. Even in more recent times, we've seen similar phenomena. Fast radio bursts, or FRBs, were first discovered in 2007, decades after the wow signal. These are millisecond-long blasts of radio waves, some repeating, some not, coming from distant galaxies. At first, they were thought to be instrumental glitches. Then they were recognized as real, but unexplained. Now they are studied as possible products of magnetars or other exotic astrophysical processes, but for a while, they carried the same ambiguity as the wow signal. Artificial, natural, a warning, or just another quirk of the universe? The fact that we now accept natural explanations for FRBs doesn't change the pattern. When anomalies first appear, they are whispers that might be saying more than we realise. The danger is that by forgetting the ones that don't fit, we lose sight of patterns that only emerge over decades. Forgotten echoes also exist in the human record. There have been reports, long before the space age, of strange lights in the sky, unexplained moving stars, signals intercepted by primitive radio equipment. Many of these can be explained as misperceptions, weather phenomena, or technical glitches. But collectively, they form a body of forgotten anomalies that parallel the ones in astronomy. Each one might not mean much. Together, they suggest that we have been receiving strange inputs from the cosmos for longer than we acknowledge. And just as with the wow signal, most were dismissed and then forgotten. The relevance to Atlas is not immediately obvious, but it becomes clearer when you consider how patterns work. A single event can always be dismissed. 2 can be explained as coincidence. 3 start to raise eyebrows. 4 or more begin to form a sequence. The wow signal was 1. Oumuamua was 2. Borisov was 3. Atlas was 4. But in between those, there were countless forgotten echoes, bursts of radio static, anomalous detections, unexplained chemical ratios that could have been seen as reinforcing the pattern if we had remembered them. Instead, they were ignored. And so, when Atlas arrived, it seemed like a fresh anomaly rather than the continuation of a long series. Silence after the wow. Signal made it easy to dismiss, but the echoes that came later should have complicated that dismissal. They didn't, because we failed to connect them. The forgotten echoes in the sky are not just background noise, they are the missing evidence, the threads that tie isolated events into a story. But without memory, without continuity, those threads remain invisible. Every generation of astronomers treats anomalies as isolated, because they do not remember the ones that came before. Every forgotten echo is a warning erased, another opportunity missed. Consider what it means if these echoes were intentional. If intelligence was sending occasional signals, briefer bursts scattered across decades, then our failure to remember them would be catastrophic. We would never see the sequence. We would never recognize the conversation. We would treat each one as noise, each one as nothing. In that scenario, the warning would not be that the signals were weak. The warning would be that we were. Our attention span, our institutional memory, our willingness to archive anomalies without connecting them. These would be the reasons we failed the test. Even if all of these echoes are natural, even if the wow signal was interference, Oumuamua a rock, Borisov a comet, Atlas a chemical outlier, the forgotten echoes still matter. They matter because they show how fragile our system of recognition is. They show how quickly data can be dismissed if it doesn't repeat. They show how easily an anomaly can vanish into archives, remembered only by specialists and never woven into the larger narrative. If warnings exist, this is how they are lost, not through malice, not through suppression, but through the simple act of forgetting. The sky is filled with echoes, but we are selective in which ones we hear. The wow signal was remembered because of an impulsive note in red ink. Oumuamua was remembered because of its strange acceleration and its timing as the first interstellar object. Borisov was remembered because it looked familiar but wasn't. Atlas was remembered because of its speed and its chemistry. But for every remembered anomaly there are dozens forgotten, and those forgotten echoes might have carried as much weight as the famous ones. They might have been the connective tissue, the context that would have made the pattern undeniable. Instead, we left them behind. This is why 1977 cannot be treated as an isolated story. The wow signal is iconic, but it is not unique. It is part of a much larger pattern of strange anomalies that have appeared and disappeared across decades. The echoes that were forgotten are the reason Atlas still seems like coincidence. Because if we had remembered, if we had connected, if we had seen the sequence, Atlas would have been impossible to ignore. Instead, we treated it the same way we treated all the others. Not as a warning, but as a curiosity. The forgotten echoes in the sky are still there. In old data tapes, in archives, in logs no one reads anymore. They wait for recognition, just like the wow. Signal waits, just like Oumuamua's trajectory waits in orbital models, just like Borisov's chemical signatures wait in lab results, just like Atlas's spectra wait in storage. They are still whispering, but only if we are willing to go back and listen. Before the word pattern could even be applied, there were visitors. The sky has always delivered strange objects, some predictable, others unexpected, and most of them quietly catalogued by astronomers who were simply trying to keep track of the shifting map above. The idea that interstellar objects could pass through our solar system was acknowledged in theory long before one was ever seen. Orbital mechanics makes it inevitable. Billions of years of gravitational slingshots and collisions in star systems across the galaxy must occasionally eject rocks, comets, and fragments into interstellar space, setting them adrift. Those fragments would wander, pulled here and there by galactic tides, until eventually some of them crossed our path. We knew they had to exist, but knowing in theory and seeing in reality are not the same. For centuries telescopes tracked comets. Bright tails swept across the night sky, terrifying ancient civilizations, inspiring myths, and in later times becoming predictable enough to map. Comets were seen as omens, but they were also seen as natural. Their orbits looped around the sun, sometimes short, sometimes long, but always bound by gravity. They belonged to us, in the sense that they were part of the solar system. Asteroids were the same, catalogued, studied, predictable. The visitors we knew about were regular, explainable and familiar, but every once in a while something didn't fit. In the 19th century there were rumours of comets with trajectories that seemed unusual, perhaps hyperbolic, perhaps unbound. In some cases the data was insufficient. Telescopes weren't precise enough, observations were limited, and orbits were poorly constrained. Those candidates were set aside, forgotten as errors. Later studies showed that most comets believed to be interstellar were actually long-period comets from the Oort cloud, making wide arcs around the sun before returning centuries or millennia later. But the possibility remained that some were not bound, that some truly were interstellar. These would have been the visitors before the pattern, the unacknowledged forerunners of what we would eventually recognise as Oumuamua, Borisov and Atlas. When astronomers in the early 20th century calculated how many interstellar objects might pass through the solar system, the numbers were small but non-zero. Statistically, one should wander through every few years or decades, too faint to be noticed unless conditions were perfect. This meant that humanity was likely missing most of them, watching the sky without realising what was slipping past. The visitors were there, but they were invisible. The pattern was unfolding but without recognition. By the time Oumuamua was discovered in 2017, we had already been visited countless times without knowing. It was only improved surveys, better telescopes and wider sky coverage that made detection possible, which raises the question, how many had come before, unnoticed, undocumented, forgotten? The forgotten visitors might have been as strange as Oumuamua, as comet-like as Borisov, as anomalous as Atlas. They might have carried warnings we never recognised because we never even saw them. In this way, the visitors before the pattern are the most haunting of all, not because of what they were, but because of what we lost by missing them. There are also stories outside formal astronomy, observations that predate modern science but describe things that sound eerily familiar. Comets that appeared suddenly, brighter and faster than expected, then vanished from the sky. Tales of stars that move strangely, objects that flared and faded. Most of these can be explained as misperceptions, as errors in observation. But some accounts carry details that suggest something more. Could some of these stories be the faint historical memory of interstellar visitors? Without precise records, we cannot know. But the idea lingers that Atlas was not the third, not the fourth, but perhaps only the latest in a line of visitors stretching back long before we had the tools to measure them. The danger in ignoring these earlier possibilities is that it narrows the story. It makes it easier to dismiss Oumuamua, Borisov and Atlas as coincidences because we see them as isolated. If we recognise the probability of many visitors across centuries, the pattern would seem less like a cluster of anomalies and more like the latest stage in a continuing process. The visitors before the pattern matter because they remind us that what we see now is only a fragment of the whole. The rest lies in the past, unrecorded or forgotten, but no less real. This context matters when we consider warnings. A warning is only effective if the receiver notices it. If dozens of interstellar objects passed before 2017 and none were recognised, then those warnings were wasted. Or perhaps they were deliberate, meant to be ignored until our technology reached the point where recognition was possible. In that case, the visitors before the pattern were test signals, calibration runs, background noise against which the real message would later stand out. The wow signal in 1977, followed by Oumuamua, Borisov and Atlas, might have been the first sequence designed to be noticed. But it only works if we understand that it is not the beginning. It is the first part we are capable of seeing, not the first part that happened. This perspective also reframes the wow signal. If the 1977 transmission was meant as an opening line, then the earlier forgotten visitors might have been precursors, physical anomalies that we lacked the ability to track. The silence after 1977 may not have been silence at all. It may have been filled with physical echoes, objects slipping past unnoticed, each one a continuation of the message. We did not hear them, not because they weren't there, but because we weren't ready. Only with Oumuamua did we finally have the tools to notice. Only then did the pattern become visible. The visitors before the pattern highlight another uncomfortable truth. Our memory is short. Astronomy advances by focusing on the present, on current data, on the latest discoveries. Old anomalies are forgotten unless they are famous. Data that cannot be explained is archived but rarely revisited. This means that if warnings are spread across centuries, humanity is ill-suited to notice. We treat each visitor as new, each anomaly as unprecedented, when in reality they may be part of a long continuity. The forgotten visitors are not just lost data. They are evidence of our inability to see beyond immediate horizons. Atlas, when it arrived, was part of this long line. But we treated it as though it stood alone, as though it were simply the latest curiosity. We did not frame it against centuries of possible unacknowledged visitors. We did not connect it to the wow signal or to the countless forgotten echoes in radio data. We isolated it, studied it, explained it, and then moved on. The visitors before the pattern remind us that this is our greatest weakness. We isolate, we forget, we fail to connect. If intelligence is testing us, that is exactly the failure it would expect. There is also a more chilling possibility. What if the visitors before the pattern were not random at all? What if they were deliberate, spaced across centuries to appear just often enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention to history? What if comets that seemed strange to ancient astronomers were not just natural, but messages disguised as omens? Ancient cultures treated comets as warnings. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the visitors have always been warnings, but we've reinterpreted them as natural simply because it is easier. If so, Atlas is only the latest chapter in a story far older than we realise. The forgotten visitors cannot be reconstructed with certainty. We can only guess at how many came, how many were seen, how many were ignored. But the statistical certainty that they must have existed means they are part of the story, whether we acknowledge them or not. They were there, passing silently through our skies, unrecorded messengers that we never answered. And in that silence, we revealed once again our greatest flaw, the inability to hear what does not shout at us twice. The visitors before the pattern were the shadows that prepared us for Oumuamua, Borisov, and Atlas. They were the context we did not remember, the warnings we never recognized, the background against which the real message was written. They matter because without them, the story seems short, isolated, coincidental. With them, the story stretches across centuries, perhaps millennia, and Atlas becomes not an anomaly but the latest signal in a sequence that has been unfolding all along. Oumuamua was the first object that forced us to admit the truth we had only ever held in theory. Interstellar visitors were not just possible, they were real, and in October of 2017 one of them passed directly through our solar system, observed by human instruments for the first time in history. Its name came later, chosen from Hawaiian to mean scout or messenger, but from the moment it was first noticed it carried an unease that has never gone away. Because Oumuamua was not just an interstellar object, it was a challenge, a disruption of expectations, and for some, the beginning of a sequence that we still have not acknowledged as a warning. Astronomers first detected Oumuamua with the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii. At first, it appeared as just another faint moving point of light, no different from the countless asteroids and comets tracked each week. But its trajectory was strange. Its orbit was hyperbolic, meaning it was not bound to the sun and would never return. It had come from outside the solar system, swung around our star at immense speed, and was already on its way back into interstellar space when we noticed it. For decades, interstellar objects had been predicted, but none had been seen. Oumuamua was the first, and that fact alone was enough to make it historic. But the details did not stop at first of its kind. As researchers studied its brightness variations, they realised it was not shaped like any asteroid we'd seen before. Its light curve suggested it was elongated, perhaps 10 times longer than it was wide, tumbling through space in a way that produced dramatic fluctuations in brightness. Some estimates even suggested it was shaped more like a pancake, wide and flat, though the truth remains uncertain. It reflected light strangely, and no telescope ever resolved it directly. We only saw its changing brightness, and from that we were forced to imagine its form. Already the object seemed alien, not in origin, but in character. Then came the acceleration. As Oumuamua passed near the Sun, its speed increased slightly more than gravity alone could explain. Normally comets show this effect when they release gas and dust, creating jets that act like tiny thrusters. But Oumuamua showed no visible signs of a tail, no outgassing that instruments could detect. The acceleration was subtle, but it was real. It demanded explanation, and none fit comfortably. Radiation pressure, outgassing too faint to see, or perhaps something else entirely. The debates began, and with them, the sense that this was no ordinary rock. For most scientists, the safe conclusion was still natural. Exotic, yes, but natural. Perhaps it was a fragment of a disrupted planet. Perhaps a shard of ice with unusual composition. Perhaps a thin, icy sheet reflecting light in odd ways. For Avi Loeb, however, the data suggested something more radical. He argued that Oumuamua might be artificial, perhaps a solar sail, a fragment of alien technology, drifting or deliberately placed. His argument sparked controversy, dividing the community. Some praised the willingness to consider extraordinary explanations, others dismissed it as sensationalism. But what mattered most was not who was right. What mattered was that Oumuamua had reopened the question first posed in 1977 by the wow signal. Could this be intentional? Could this be the whisper we ignored once before, returning in physical form? The comparison is hard to avoid. The wow signal lasted 72 seconds and then vanished. Oumuamua was visible for a few weeks before fading from sight, its trajectory carrying it away faster than our telescopes could track. Both events were brief, both were unrepeatable, both left us with data that raised more questions than answers. The silence after 1977 echoed in the silence of 2017. A signal once, then nothing. A visitor once, then gone. Each time we were left with unresolved anomalies, unable to prove anything, unwilling to believe too much. The pattern was there, even if we refused to name it. Oumuamua was called a scout, but scouts imply others to follow. That is why it deserves the title of harbinger. It was not only the first interstellar object detected, it was the one that forced us to confront the possibility that more were coming. And they did. Just 2 years later, Borisov arrived, and then in 2025, Atlas. If Oumuamua was the first note in a new sequence, then it was also a warning that the silence of 1977 was not permanent. Something was happening. Something was escalating. The strangeness of Oumuamua went beyond its shape and acceleration. Its reflectivity was unusual, suggesting a surface different from most known asteroids. Its lack of a visible coma confused expectations, because by many measures it behaved like a comet without looking like one. It fit into no existing category. That alone should have raised alarms. Nature is capable of producing oddities, but when those oddities align with the kinds of anomalies we might expect from intention, the weight of coincidence grows heavy. The wow signal had been a clean, narrow-band transmission at the hydrogen line, the perfect frequency for interstellar communication. Oumuamua was a clean, anomalous visitor, the perfect candidate for speculation. To ignore that parallel was to ignore the possibility of a warning repeated across different forms. Yet the official response followed the same pattern as before. Papers were published, debates held, hypotheses proposed. Radiation pressure was the favoured explanation for the acceleration, even if it required Oumuamua to be unusually thin. Its shape was left unresolved, its lack of a coma treated as an outlier. The artificial hypothesis was considered fringe, criticised for lack of direct evidence. Once again, the anomaly was neutralised by explanation, by cautious dismissal, by the unwillingness to see it as part of a larger story. The harbinger was treated as a curiosity, not a warning. What makes Oumuamua important is not just its anomalies, but its timing. 40 years after the wow signal, the first interstellar visitor arrives, carrying mysteries that echo the unresolved questions of 1977. That is not proof of connection, but it is suggestive. If intelligence wanted to test us, wanted to see whether we could connect the dots, the sequence makes sense. First a radio signal, then a physical visitor. First sound, then sight. First data in the abstract, then data in the concrete. Each one demanding recognition, each one testing whether we were willing to consider the possibility. As the years pass, Oumuamua will remain a ghost in the data. We cannot chase it, cannot catch it, cannot study it further. Its mysteries are frozen in the observations we manage during its brief window of visibility. That brevity is part of its power. Like the wow signal, it appeared once and then left us behind. And like the wow signal, it left us with the question of whether the silence afterward was the real message. If so, then Oumuamua was not just a visitor. It was a deliberate echo of the past, a way of reminding us that warnings do not repeat themselves forever. When Atlas arrived, its speed, its chemistry, its age made it undeniable that interstellar visitors carry strangeness we cannot easily explain. But Atlas was already framed by Oumuamua. It was already the continuation of a story that began with the harbinger. The warning was escalating, the anomalies piling up. To see Atlas without Oumuamua is to miss the point. The harbinger showed us what to expect, and the fact that we ignored it revealed everything about how we would handle what came next. Oumuamua's legacy is therefore not about what it was, but about what it represented. The first visitor we could recognise, the first chance to prove that the whispers of 1977 had not been meaningless. The first opportunity to admit that we might be part of a conversation spanning decades. We ignored it, and so we ignored the harbinger. But a harbinger does not exist in isolation. It exists to announce what follows. In that sense, Oumuamua was never just itself. It was the opening of a door we still pretend is closed. When Oumuamua passed through, many wondered if it was unique. Perhaps it was a once-in-a-lifetime event, an accident of timing that we happened to witness because of new surveys and better instruments. But 2 years later, in 2019, another visitor arrived, and this time there was no ambiguity about its interstellar origin. The official designation was 2I Borisov, the second interstellar object ever observed, and it could not have been more different from Oumuamua. Where Oumuamua was strange, elongated, and comet-like in behaviour but asteroid-like in appearance, Borisov was immediately recognisable as a comet. It had a coma, a tail, jets of gas, features that fit within expectations, and yet, beneath that familiarity, Borisov carried its own anomalies, subtler but no less unsettling, making it the stranger in this unfolding sequence. Borisov was first spotted by amateur astronomer Gennady Borisov in August 2019, using a homemade telescope. That in itself is part of the story. The discovery of a cosmic messenger, an interstellar object millions of years old, came not from a massive observatory or space agency, but from the patient work of an individual scanning the skies. It was a reminder that interstellar visitors are not necessarily spectacular, that they can slip past unnoticed, unless someone happens to be watching at the right moment. By the time professional telescopes confirmed its orbit, it was clear that Borisov was on a hyperbolic trajectory, unbound to the sun, just like Oumuamua. But unlike Oumuamua, Borisov's cometary activity left no doubt about its nature. It was not just an inert rock. It was a body shedding gas and dust as it approached the sun, behaving the way comets are supposed to behave. That familiarity was comforting. After the debates about Oumuamua, asteroid or comet, natural or artificial, Borisov seemed to settle the issue. Interstellar objects exist and they can look like normal comets. Nothing mysterious there, nothing that demanded extraordinary explanations. But as astronomers studied it more closely, they began to notice differences. Its chemistry was not quite like the comets we know from our own solar system. Spectroscopic analysis revealed unusually high levels of carbon monoxide, far more than typical comets here contain. In some measurements, it carried as much as 3 times more CO than water, a ratio rarely if ever seen in local bodies. That difference might not seem dramatic, but it suggested an origin in conditions unlike those in which our solar system's comets formed. Carbon monoxide is volatile, easily lost over time. For Borisov to contain so much, it likely formed in a region far colder than our solar nebula, perhaps at the distant edges of another star system where temperatures remained low enough to preserve such compounds. That made Borisov older, stranger, a product of chemistry unfamiliar to us. Its composition told a story of an alien birthplace, a fragment of a system that may not resemble ours at all, and in that sense, it was a stranger not just because it came from beyond, but because it carried a fingerprint we'd never seen before. If Oumuamua was unsettling because of its physical oddities, Borisov was unsettling because of its chemical ones. Both were anomalies, but of different kinds. Both raised questions about what interstellar visitors might mean, and together they began to form a sequence. The WOW signal in 1977 had been a burst of radio data. Oumuamua in 2017 had been a mysterious shape with unexplained acceleration. Borisov in 2019 was a comet with strange chemistry. 3 anomalies in 4 decades, each different, each isolated, but each pointing toward the same conclusion. We were being given pieces of a puzzle, and we were refusing to assemble them. Borisov was studied intensely while it was visible. The Hubble Space Telescope tracked it, as did major ground-based observatories. Its coma and tail offered more data than Oumuamua ever could, since Oumuamua had been dry, lacking obvious emissions. But the more data collected, the more Borisov stood apart from our expectations. Its grains of dust were unusually small, its outgassing unusually consistent, and its volatile content alien to what we know. Some described it as the most pristine comet ever observed, a body untouched by the heat and activity that gradually alter comets in our system. It was a fragment of another star's frozen outskirts, preserved across interstellar travel, now evaporating before our eyes. To most, this was only a triumph of science, a chance to study the material of another solar system directly. But in the context of warnings, Borisov meant something else. If each anomaly is a whisper, then Borisov was a whisper in chemistry, a way of telling us that the universe beyond is not like what we know, that objects from other systems carry signatures we cannot dismiss as familiar. In the sequence of wow to Oumuamua to Borisov, the message was escalating in diversity. First sound, then shape, then composition. Each new visitor spoke in a different language, testing whether we were willing to translate. The official narrative treated Borisov as reassuring. Unlike Oumuamua, it looked like a comet. That familiarity allowed the anomaly of its chemistry to be softened, explained as simply an example of cosmic diversity. After all, star systems form under different conditions. Why wouldn't comets vary? But that reasoning misses the weight of sequence. In isolation, Borisov is just a comet with unusual chemistry. In sequence, it is the continuation of a pattern of anomalies that began in 1977, Its strangeness is not erased by its familiarity, it is amplified by what came before and after, and yet, just like with the WOW, signal and Oumuamua, Borisov passed quickly. By the time it was closest to Earth in December 2019, it was already fading. Within months it had receded into the darkness, leaving behind only data. It became another ghost in the archives, another visitor remembered only by specialists, another anomaly explained away as natural. The stranger had come and gone, and we had treated it not as a messenger but as a curiosity. There is another aspect of Borisov that makes it haunting. It fragmented as it left the sun, breaking into pieces as its ices evaporated. This was expected. Comets often break apart under solar heating. But the symbolism is unavoidable. The stranger did not leave whole. It left in fragments, dissolving as it passed, as if to say that even warnings do not last forever. They erode, they vanish, they are destroyed by neglect. In its final disintegration, Borisov may have carried the clearest message of all. Pay attention while you can, because once it is gone for good. Borisov did not carry the debates that Oumuamua did. It did not inspire headlines about alien technology or heated arguments about propulsion. It was safer scientifically because it fit a known category. But the strangeness was still there, quieter, easier to ignore, easier to forget. That made it, in some ways, more dangerous. Because a warning that looks familiar is easier to dismiss than one that does not. Oumuamua forced us to confront the unfamiliar. Borisov invited us to look away, and when Atlas arrived, most of us had already moved on. The stranger's role in this story is crucial. It reminds us that not all anomalies announce themselves with drama. Some arrive wearing masks of familiarity, hiding their significance in plain sight. Some slip into our categories, distort them slightly and then vanish before we realize what was different. Borisov was one of those. A comet, yes, but also something else. A fragment of another world, carrying chemistry that did not belong here, whispering in a language of carbon monoxide and dust. A stranger among us seen and then forgotten. Then came Atlas. By the time this third interstellar visitor was recognized in 2025, the framework for how we treated such anomalies had already been built. The WOW signal in 1977 had been logged, debated, and filed away. Oumuamua in 2017 had been explained with uncomfortable natural hypotheses and dismissed as a curiosity. Borisov in 2019 had reassured scientists with comet-like behaviour while hiding its strangeness and chemistry. Each event had followed the same arc: notice, speculate, explain, and forget. Atlas entered this sequence, but it did not arrive quietly. It came faster, stranger, older, carrying with it not just questions but the possibility that the warning had been growing louder each time. The discovery of Atlas began like so many others, with surveys scanning the skies for near-Earth objects. The Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, or ATLAS, had been designed to provide early warning of potentially hazardous asteroids. Its wide-field telescopes captured faint moving points of light, tracking anything that might come close to our planet. In early 2025, one of those faint points stood out. At first, it seemed like just another comet, no different from the dozens identified each year. But as the orbit was calculated, the realization came quickly. This object was moving too fast. Its path was hyperbolic, not bound to the sun, and its velocity was nearly double that of Oumuamua. It was interstellar and it was extraordinary. Unlike Oumuamua, Atlas was recognized as interstellar almost immediately. The speed was unmistakable, and the trajectory confirmed it. Unlike Borisov, it did not fit comfortably into the familiar category of comets. Its emissions were different, dominated not by water but by carbon dioxide, in ratios unlike anything seen in our solar system. Its spectra revealed chemical signatures that defied easy comparison, suggesting origins in a region of the galaxy far older and colder than our own. For scientists, this was an opportunity, a chance to study material from beyond the solar system with greater clarity than before. But for those willing to see patterns, it was something more. It was the continuation of a sequence, the latest escalation in a chain of anomalies that began decades earlier. Atlas was not just another interstellar visitor. Its speed alone carried meaning. At nearly twice the velocity of Oumuamua, it suggested an origin in the galactic thick disk, a population of stars older than the Sun by billions of years. That meant Atlas was not simply a fragment from another planetary system. It was a relic of ancient galactic history, older than our solar system, older than Earth itself, carrying chemistry frozen since a time before our planet formed. To hold such an object in our telescopes was to hold a piece of the galaxy's memory. And yet, what it told us was not comforting. Its chemistry did not match our expectations. Its presence was rare enough to raise questions. Its arrival so soon after Oumuamua and Borisov seemed less like random chance and more like punctuation in a message. For decades, astronomers had predicted that interstellar objects should pass through the solar system regularly, perhaps once every few years, though most too faint to detect. But the fact that 3 had been observed in less than a decade suggested something unusual. The detection rate was accelerating, the anomalies piling up. Some attributed this to better surveys, wider coverage, more sensitive instruments. But even accounting for those improvements, the sequence felt improbable. The WOW signal in 1977, Oumuamua in 2017, Borisov in 2019, Atlas in 2025, each one stranger than the last, each one adding a layer of unease. To see them as coincidence was possible. To see them as a pattern was unavoidable. Atlas's chemistry raised the loudest questions. In our solar system, comets are dominated by water ice, with carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide in smaller proportions. But Atlas reversed that balance. It was overwhelmingly carbon dioxide, a composition we had never seen before. Some suggested this meant it formed in a region of its parent system very different from ours, perhaps around a star with unique conditions. Others suggested it had been altered during its journey through interstellar space, exposed to cosmic rays that transformed its surface. But even these explanations struggle to account for the ratios observed. Once again, the data refused to conform to expectations. Once again, we reach for natural explanations that did not quite fit. In the language of warnings, Atlas was the loudest yet. Its speed said urgency. Its age said ancient knowledge. Its chemistry said alien. It was as if each anomaly had been escalating in volume, daring us to listen. The WOW signal had been subtle, a brief whisper in radio static. Oumuamua had been visual, an odd shape and unexplained acceleration. Borisov had been chemical, familiar in form but alien in substance. Atlas combined all of these qualities, speed, chemistry, origin, into one package, forcing us to confront the possibility that we were no longer dealing with coincidence. And yet, the response followed the same arc. Papers were written, debates held, natural hypotheses proposed. The artificial possibility was once again set aside as too speculative. The warning once again was ignored. The story of Atlas is not just about what it was, but about when it came. Its arrival in 2025 placed it within a timeline that could no longer be dismissed as random. If the WOW signal had been the opening, Oumuamua the harbinger, Borisov the stranger, then Atlas was the crescendo. It carried with it the weight of all the anomalies before it, and in doing so, it forced a choice. We could continue to treat each event in isolation, filing them as curiosities, or we could see them as part of a sequence, a pattern that might represent the closest thing to a warning we will ever receive. The unsettling part is that Atlas, like the others, gave us only a brief window. Observed for months, studied intensely, and then gone, retreating into the darkness of interstellar space. Its message, whatever it was not repeated. Its silence echoed the silence of 1977, the silence of Oumuamua, the silence of Borisov. Each time we were given just enough to notice, never enough to confirm. Each time we convinced ourselves that absence meant insignificance. But if the pattern is real, then absence is the message. Silence is the warning. Atlas came, it spoke in chemistry and speed, and then it left. And we, once again, chose not to hear. The story continues because Atlas was not an ending. It was part of an unfolding process, a sequence that stretches across decades and perhaps centuries. The visitors before the pattern, the forgotten echoes in the sky, the anomalies we dismissed, all of them point to a larger truth, that we are being tested not for survival, but for awareness, that the warning is not about impact or danger, but about recognition. Atlas was the clearest, the loudest, the most undeniable, and yet we treated it just like the rest. A comet, a curiosity, a data set. We filed it away, and with it we filed away the possibility that we had just been handed the loudest warning yet. Speed is one of the simplest things to measure in astronomy, but it is also one of the most revealing. An object's velocity tells us where it has been, how it moves through gravitational fields, and whether or not it belongs to the solar system. For most comets and asteroids, the numbers fall within familiar ranges. They orbit the Sun at predictable speeds, bound by gravity, their trajectories shaped by the same forces that govern planets. When Oumuamua arrived in 2017, its speed already marked it as different. It was faster than anything that belonged here, its path hyperbolic, ensuring it would never return. But even Oumuamua's velocity was within what theory predicted for interstellar objects. Atlas in 2025 forced a re-evaluation. Its speed was so high, so far beyond expectation, that it stretched the limits of what we considered possible. Atlas entered the solar system travelling at nearly twice the speed of Oumuamua. That number alone was enough to surprise astronomers. Oumuamua had approached at about 26 kilometers per second relative to the Sun, already more than fast enough to escape. Atlas, by comparison, was moving at over 50 kilometers per second on approach. After swinging past the Sun, its outbound speed would exceed anything we had ever recorded for a natural object. The numbers made it unmistakably interstellar. But they also raised a deeper question. How could anything move that fast and still be detected here, in this narrow window of space? In galactic terms, Atlas was not just a traveller. It was a relic of the thick disk, a population of stars and matter older than the thin disk where our Sun resides. The thick disk is ancient, formed billions of years before Earth. Objects from that region carry with them not just speed, but history. They move differently, shaped by dynamics older than our solar system, tracing paths that speak of deep galactic time. To detect something from the thick disk passing through our system was to capture a fragment of an era before Earth's birth. That was astonishing on its own, but the velocity suggested urgency, as though this visitor had not just drifted here, but had been sent with momentum that defied randomness. In isolation, high speed might be explained by chance. An object could be ejected from its home system with enough force to travel across the galaxy. Gravitational interactions between giant planets or stellar encounters can fling debris into interstellar space at extreme velocities, but the timing of Atlas made chance harder to accept. After Oumuamua and Borisov, the appearance of another interstellar object so soon, and moving so fast, began to stretch probability. Each event might be rare, but stacked together, they began to look orchestrated. If the wow signal was the whisper, Oumuamua the harbinger, Borisov the stranger, then Atlas was the shout. Its speed was the emphasis, the bold underline in a message we still refuse to read. Speed also dictates opportunity. The faster an object moves, the less time we have to study it. Oumuamua gave us weeks. Borisov gave us months. Atlas, moving at nearly double the velocity, gave us less time than either. Observations had to be made quickly, before it faded into darkness again. The window was short, and in that shortness was another kind of warning. If these objects are messages, then their velocity is part of the design. They arrive fast, they leave faster, and we are tested to see whether we care enough to act before they are gone. The faster the object, the harder the test. Atlas was almost impossible to study in detail, and perhaps that was the point. What makes speed so unsettling is that it implies energy. To move at 50 kilometers per second relative to the sun requires an immense push, far greater than the gentle nudges of gravity most comets experience. If Atlas was natural, then it had to have been ejected violently from its home system, thrown out in a way that preserved its composition for billions of years until it crossed paths with us. If it was not natural, if it was in some way designed or influenced, then the speed becomes part of the message. Too fast to be coincidence, too precise to be ignored, too short-lived to be easy. A signal delivered in motion, not in sound. Atlas's velocity also connects back to the silence of 1977. The wow. Signal lasted 72 seconds and then vanished. Atlas was visible for months, but its velocity ensured it would vanish just as completely, just as irretrievably. Both were brief, both were gone before we could confirm anything, both left us with only unresolved data. The wow signal tested our patience. Atlas tested our urgency. In both cases, the silence afterward was louder than the event itself. Astronomers worked quickly to measure Atlas's orbit, its spectrum, its activity. They debated its chemistry, its likely origin, its significance. But behind the data was a deeper unease. The velocity suggested a timeline beyond our control. This was not an object we could redirect, capture, or study at leisure. It was here briefly, on its way elsewhere, and we had to decide whether that fleeting encounter meant something. For most, it meant little beyond science. Another data point, another confirmation of interstellar visitors. For others, it meant a warning written in speed, a demonstration that messages do not wait for us. They pass whether or not we listen. Speed that shouldn't be possible forces us to confront the limits of our expectations. When predictions say interstellar objects should be rare, and then 3 arrive within a decade, probability begins to lose its grip. When those objects move at velocities far beyond what we anticipated, coincidence begins to look fragile. Atlas's speed was not just a number, it was a statement. That interstellar visitors are not accidents, that warnings do not come slowly. That urgency is part of the design. The unsettling truth is that speed leaves no room for hesitation. Oumuamua challenged us but gave us weeks to argue. Borisov offered comfort while hiding its strangeness and chemistry. Atlas gave us almost no time at all. It came fast, left faster, and forced us to decide whether a fleeting anomaly mattered. Our decision was the same as before. We explained it, categorized it, and moved on. The warning once again was ignored. Atlas's velocity ensured that it would never return. Its path carried it away into the galaxy, beyond reach, beyond study, beyond confirmation. All we have left are the records, the spectra, the orbital calculations. Another ghost in the archives, another message erased by motion. The speed that shouldn't be possible was not just about physics, it was about us, about how little time we had, about how warnings vanish if not recognized. Oumuamua hinted. Borisov suggested. Atlas demanded, and we, as always, chose silence. Chemistry is the language of the universe. Stars speak it in their light, planets reveal it in their atmospheres, and comets carry it frozen in their ices. For astronomers, every spectrum is a sentence, every absorption, line a word, every unexpected ratio a subtle twist in meaning. When Atlas was studied in 2025, what it said was not what we expected. Its chemistry was unlike anything in our solar system, unlike Oumuamua's strange silence or Borisov's alien volatility. Atlas spoke in ratios that seemed deliberately out of place, as though its code was written to be noticed precisely because it did not fit. In our solar system, comets are dominated by water ice. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide are present, but always as supporting characters, secondary to the abundance of H2O. This makes sense given the conditions under which our system formed. Water is abundant, stable, and preserved easily in the cold outer reaches. But Atlas inverted that expectation. Its spectrum showed that carbon dioxide was not secondary, it was primary. The comet was overwhelmingly CO2, with water present in only small proportions. In some analyses, water was almost absent altogether. This reversal was startling. No known comet in the solar system had ever displayed such chemistry. At first, explanations leaned toward formation. Perhaps Atlas had originated in an extremely cold environment, even colder than the outer reaches of our Oort cloud, where carbon dioxide could condense more readily than water. Or perhaps it had been altered during its long journey through interstellar space, its surface transformed by cosmic rays, its chemistry restructured in ways we did not yet understand. But even these possibilities felt insufficient. The ratios were not just unusual, they were extreme, outliers beyond outliers. Atlas was not simply a comet from another system. It was something stranger, something that seemed to carry a message in its chemistry. If you frame this as coincidence, the story is easy. Interstellar objects come from different places, and so their compositions vary. Borisov was rich in carbon monoxide. Atlas was rich in carbon dioxide. Oumuamua was dry. Together they show the diversity of the galaxy. But if you frame it as a sequence, the story changes. Each anomaly speaks in a different channel. The WOW signal in 1977 spoke in radio, at the hydrogen line, a frequency chosen for universality. Oumuamua spoke in shape and motion, an object that defied categories. Borisov spoke in chemistry, carrying more carbon monoxide than expected. And Atlas spoke in chemistry too, but louder, clearer, with a ratio so alien it could not be ignored. Seen this way, the chemistry was not random. It was code. The code might not be literal, not binary or linguistic. It might be symbolic, a way of showing us that the anomalies are not accidents. The inversion of chemistry, the deliberate strangeness, could be the equivalent of underlining a word in a sentence. Pay attention, this does not belong here. The silence of 1977 had been ambiguous. Oumuamua's acceleration had been debated. Borisov's ratios had been explainable. But Atlas left less room for comfort. Its chemistry was so far outside our expectations that even natural explanations felt strained. If this was coincidence, it was coincidence piled upon coincidence. If it was code, it was the clearest yet. Consider how we ourselves search for life on exoplanets. We look for biosignatures, chemical imbalances in atmospheres that should not exist naturally. Oxygen paired with methane, for example, suggests biology, because those gases destroy each other quickly unless replenished. We treat chemical imbalance as code, as a signal that life is at work. Atlas presented us with an imbalance too, not in an atmosphere, but in its composition, a body dominated by carbon dioxide when it should have been dominated by water. In our own methods, that would qualify as suspicious, as intentional, as worth investigating. But when faced with Atlas, we explained it away. We treated the code as noise. The unsettling possibility is that this is exactly how a warning would be delivered. Not in words, not in symbols, not in mathematics etched across the stars, but in chemistry. Because chemistry is universal. Every civilization capable of science would recognize it. Every astronomer would understand spectra. A chemical anomaly is not tied to culture, not tied to language, not tied to interpretation. It is pure physics, pure truth. To send a message in chemistry is to send it in the only language every intelligence must learn. Atlas's chemistry was not an accident. It was a statement. Yet, as with every anomaly before, our response was cautious. Papers proposed natural origins. Data was catalogued. The anomaly was noted but not pursued as extraordinary. The artificial hypothesis, once again, was left in the margins. The code went unacknowledged, and in that failure the warning was ignored. The chemistry had spoken, but we refused to hear. There's also the haunting connection between Atlas's chemistry and its speed. High velocity meant little time to study, little chance to resolve debates. The code was delivered quickly, flashed in front of us and then gone. Like the wow signal's 72 seconds, Atlas's anomalous chemistry was a fleeting message. Enough to notice, not enough to prove. The combination of speed and chemistry was not just coincidence, it was design. A message written in numbers and ratios carried past us too quickly for comfort, testing whether we would care enough to see. The question is not whether Atlas was natural or artificial. The question is why its chemistry fit so perfectly into the sequence of anomalies that began decades earlier. If the wow signal was hydrogen, the most universal element, then Atlas's carbon dioxide was its echo. Hydrogen is the foundation of stars, carbon dioxide is the breath of biology. The two frequencies, one in radio, one in chemistry, might not be accidental opposites. They might be paired deliberately, two universal markers of life and communication. If that is the case, then the warning is not just about recognition, it is about survival. Because carbon dioxide is also a warning in our own context. On Earth, rising CO2 is a marker of climate change, of destabilization, of a future that threatens us. For an interstellar object to arrive carrying a composition dominated by CO2 is almost too symbolic. It is coincidence so sharp it feels pointed. Was Atlas a mirror, showing us our own trajectory? Was its chemistry code not just for anomaly but for consequence? If so, the warning was not subtle. It was precise. Atlas's chemistry cannot be remeasured. Like Oumuamua and Borisov, it has passed, leaving only the data we collected in its brief window of visibility. That data will be studied, reanalyzed, debated, but the opportunity is gone. The code was shown once and then erased by motion. The silence that follows is the same silence that has followed every anomaly before. It is not the silence of absence, but the silence of refusal. We had the message. We chose not to hear it. The code remains, though, in the archives. Spectra that do not fit. Ratios that do not belong. Chemistry that should not exist. It waits, like the wow. Signal waits, like Oumuamua's trajectory waits, like Borisov's CO waits. All the pieces are there, all the warnings still visible, if only we are willing to read them together. Atlas was the loudest yet, the one that spoke in the most universal language of all, and yet, even in code, we ignored it. The most unsettling thing about the story of Atlas is not its chemistry, not its speed, not even its ancient origin. It is the fact that by the time it arrived, the pattern should have been obvious. The wow signal in 1977, Oumuamua in 2017, Borisov in 2019, Atlas in 2025. 4 extraordinary anomalies across less than 50 years, each of them different, each of them difficult to explain, and each of them dismissed in isolation. That isolation is the key. We did not want to connect them. We did not want to admit that they might be related. We refused to see the pattern, because patterns demand recognition, and recognition demands response. It was safer to treat them separately, to file them in different drawers, to pretend they did not belong to the same story. Science is built on caution, on restraint, on skepticism. That is what gives it power. But it is also what blinds it when the anomalies line up. The wow signal was catalogued as unexplained, but not evidence of anything extraordinary. Oumuamua was catalogued as an unusual rock with unconventional explanations. Borisov was catalogued as a comet from another system, exotic, but still natural. Atlas was catalogued as another comet with unusual chemistry, requiring further study but nothing more. Each was treated individually, explained as best as possible, placed into categories that allowed us to move on. What we refused to do was place them side by side and ask the obvious question, what if they are not separate? The refusal was not accidental. It was cultural. In science, suggesting that a radio signal might be artificial risks ridicule. Suggesting that a rock tumbling through space might be technology risks careers. Suggesting that chemical anomalies might be code risks losing credibility. Each anomaly could be studied safely as long as it remained isolated. But connecting them was dangerous, because it pushed too close to the extraordinary claim. And so, we chose not to connect them. We pretended the similarities were coincidences. We pretended the timing meant nothing. We pretended that the universe could throw whispers, rocks and comets at us in rapid succession without meaning. That refusal is the real anomaly. The pattern is clear when you step back. A narrowband radio signal at the hydrogen line in 1977, appearing once and then vanishing. A hyperbolic object with unusual shape and unexplained acceleration in 2017. Another interstellar object in 2019. This time comet-like, but with chemistry unlike anything in our system. A third in 2025, faster than any before, older than Earth, dominated by carbon dioxide instead of water. Each one escalating. Each one adding a new layer of strangeness. Each one demanding recognition. If this is coincidence, then coincidence has begun to look deliberate. If this is random, then randomness has begun to mimic design. The refusal to see the pattern is not just about caution, it is about fear. If we admit the pattern, then we admit the possibility that intelligence is involved. If we admit that possibility, then we must ask why. Why would signals come sporadically in different forms over decades? Why would they escalate in strangeness, testing our ability to notice? Why would they carry silence as their defining feature? These questions are not comfortable. They do not fit within our frameworks. And so, it is easier to ignore the pattern than to confront the implications. But ignoring the pattern does not erase it. It is still there, waiting in the data. The wow signal still sits in the archives, a burst of intensity at the most universal frequency in the cosmos. Oumuamua's trajectory is still mapped, its acceleration still unexplained. Borisov's chemical ratios are still recorded, its strangeness still undeniable. Atlas's spectra are still stored, its carbon dioxide dominance still anomalous. The pieces are all there, untouched, waiting. The only thing missing is recognition. What makes the refusal so tragic is that we already know how to see patterns. In exoplanet studies, in cosmology, in biology, we look for faint signals that repeat across datasets, building connections that reveal truths. We are capable of pulling threads from noise, of turning anomalies into discoveries. But in this case, when the anomalies point toward intelligence, we recoil, we hesitate, we refuse. That refusal is not scientific in nature, it is psychological. It is about the weight of what it would mean if we're not alone, if we're being tested, if we're being warned. The refusal is a shield against consequence. Atlas was the moment when the shield should have broken. Its chemistry was too different, its speed too high, its age too vast. It was not an anomaly that could be explained easily. It was not a curiosity that could be filed away quietly. It was the loudest in the sequence, the clearest escalation, the one that made the pattern undeniable. And yet we still refused. The same debates unfolded, the same explanations proposed, the same caution applied. Natural hypotheses were strained to fit, artificial hypotheses were set aside, and the pattern was left unacknowledged. It was as though our refusal had become reflex, a survival instinct against recognition. The danger in refusing to see the pattern is not that we miss an opportunity for discovery, it is that we fail a test we might not get again. If these anomalies are part of a message, then the sequence may not continue forever. The wow signal came once and never repeated. Oumuamua came once and is gone. Borisov came once and disintegrated. Atlas came once and has already faded. The pattern is finite, the opportunities brief, the windows closing. If we refuse to see it now, there may not be another chance. That is what makes the refusal catastrophic. It is not just ignorance, it is loss. The unsettling truth is that recognition does not require proof. To see the pattern does not mean declaring contact. It does not mean rewriting textbooks overnight. It means acknowledging that anomalies are stacking in ways that defy chance. It means being willing to ask whether silence is intentional, whether chemistry is code, whether speed is design. It means looking at the sequence and treating it not as 4 isolated events, but as one message spread across decades. That recognition alone would be enough to change our approach, to shift us from dismissal to investigation. But without it, we remain stuck, trapped in the cycle of refusal. The pattern we refuse to see is still visible. It is not hidden, it is not subtle, it is written across the data of half a century. But recognition requires courage, and courage is what we lack. We tell ourselves that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and in doing so, we ignore the fact that extraordinary patterns are evidence in themselves. The Wow, Signal, Oumuamua, Borisov, Atlas, each extraordinary, each unrepeatable, each unexplained. Together they are not coincidence. Together they are code. Together they are the warning. The refusal to see that pattern is not a flaw of science. It is a flaw of humanity. Looking back across the decades, the most striking feature is not that the anomalies appeared, but that we treated them as isolated curiosities instead of as milestones in a timeline. The Wow signal in 1977, Oumuamua in 2017, Borisov in 2019, and Atlas in 2025 were not scattered accidents. They were events separated by intervals that should have drawn our attention. Each one carried its own strangeness, each one escalated the tone, and each one arrived just far enough apart that forgetting the previous anomaly felt natural. What we never did was place them on a single line and ask what that sequence was telling us. The timeline begins in the late 1970s, when radio astronomy was still maturing. The Big Ear telescope in Ohio detected a 72-second burst of radio energy at the hydrogen line, the most universal frequency in the universe. It happened once, it was never repeated, and it was filed away as unexplained. If that had been the only anomaly in history, perhaps it could be excused as noise. But 40 years later, in 2017, the next milestone appeared. Oumuamua, the first recognised interstellar object, slipped through the solar system, carrying with it mysteries of shape, brightness, and acceleration that defied categories. That gap of 40 years should have been a clue. The first anomaly was in radio, the second in physical form, and the interval between them was nearly the length of 2 scientific generations. The gap gave us time to forget. By the time Oumuamua arrived, the Wow signal was a historical footnote, not an active part of the conversation. Then came Borisov in 2019. Only 2 years later, the interval had collapsed. Instead of 4 decades, the next visitor arrived almost immediately, and this time it was not ambiguous. Its hyperbolic orbit made it undeniably interstellar, but its chemistry made it undeniably strange. An interstellar comet with volatile ratios unlike anything in our system. If the Wow signal was a whisper, and Oumuamua was a gesture, then Borisov was a statement. But because it looked familiar in form, it was easy to treat it as ordinary. The short interval between Oumuamua and Borisov should have been another clue. Something had changed, the pace was accelerating, and then Atlas in 2025, only 6 years after Borisov, doubling the speed of Oumuamua, older than the Earth itself, carrying chemistry that reversed the balance of everything we expected. By then the intervals had shrunk dramatically. 4 decades between the first two, 2 years between the next, 6 years between the third and fourth. The timeline was no longer sparse, it was compact, escalating in pace and intensity. But instead of seeing it as a pattern, we saw it as coincidence. We saw 4 isolated events instead of one sequence, 4 anomalies instead of a timeline of missed messages. When you lay them side by side, the pattern is unmistakable. 1977. A signal in the most universal frequency of the cosmos. 2017. An object with inexplicable shape and motion. 2019. Another object with alien chemistry. 2025. A third object, faster, older, and stranger than the rest. Each one is separated by silence. Each one is brief. Each one is gone forever after the moment passes. That silence is not absence. It is part of the timeline. It is the punctuation between the messages. And yet, every time we treated the silence as disproof. We said the wow signal was meaningless because it never repeated. We said Oumuamua was meaningless because it left too quickly. We said Borisov was meaningless because it disintegrated. We said Atlas was meaningless because we would never see it again. The timeline was erased by our refusal to hold anomalies together. It is worth asking what the timeline looks like from the perspective of intelligence. If you wanted to send a message across decades, across generations, how would you do it? You could not rely on continuous transmission, because continuous signals are lost in the noise of the cosmos. You could not rely on one form alone, because skeptics would dismiss it as coincidence. You would need variety. You would need escalation. You would need to spread the message across different channels so that recognition required connecting them. A signal here, a rock there, a comet next, chemistry after. A series of anomalies that look unrelated unless you choose to connect them. That is what the timeline looks like when viewed as a message. It is not scattered. It is deliberate. Our failure was not in detecting the anomalies. We saw all of them. Our telescopes caught the wow signal, Oumuamua, Borisov and Atlas. Our instruments worked. Our data was accurate. The failure was in interpretation. We did not place them on a single line. We did not ask what 4 extraordinary anomalies across half a century meant together. We treated each as noise, when the noise was actually signal. The missed messages were not hidden. They were simply ignored. The danger of missing the timeline is that it teaches us nothing. We continue to look at the sky as though it is silent, as though each anomaly is isolated. But the timeline suggests that silence is an illusion. The messages are there, spaced across decades, waiting for us to link them. If Atlas is part of a sequence, then there may be more. The intervals might shrink again. Another visitor could arrive within years, perhaps months. Another signal could flare in the radio spectrum. Another anomaly could appear in chemistry or physics. But unless we acknowledge the timeline, we will treat the next one the same way. A curiosity, an event, a file in the archives, another missed message. The weight of the timeline is not in the events themselves, but in their accumulation. Any one of them could be dismissed. Together, they are undeniable, and yet, denial is exactly what we chose. We denied the wow signal by calling it interference. We denied Oumuamua by forcing natural explanations. We denied Borisov by hiding its chemistry in the comfort of familiarity. We denied Atlas by framing it as just another comet. The denial itself is the story. The refusal to see the timeline is the reason the warnings mean nothing. What makes this failure worse is that we know how to read timelines in every other context. We look at ice cores and see climate history. We look at fossils and see evolution. We look at supernova remnants and see stellar lifespans. We are good at building stories from scattered data when the data fits within our frameworks. But here, when the data points towards something extraordinary, we refuse to build the story. We scatter the dots and pretend they are unconnected. The timeline is missed not because it is hidden, but because we are unwilling to draw the line. The anomalies are still there. The wow signal in the records of 1977. Oumuamua's light curve in the archives of 2017. Borisov's spectra from 2019. Atlas's chemistry from 2025. The timeline has already been written. What remains is whether we are willing to read it. If we do not, then the next anomaly will not surprise us. It will simply join the others in the archive of missed messages, part of a story that we refuse to tell. Coincidence is the word that shields us from discomfort. It is the easiest way to disarm anomalies, to fold them back into the ordinary, to prevent them from carrying more meaning than we want them to. When the WOW signal was heard in 1977, the simplest explanation was that it was a coincidence of noise and timing. When Oumuamua passed through in 2017, its elongated shape and unexplained acceleration were framed as coincidence born from unusual natural processes. When Borisov appeared in 2019, with chemistry unlike our comets, the strangeness was explained away as the coincidence of alien formation conditions. And when Atlas blazed past in 2025, with its overwhelming carbon dioxide and impossible speed, the conclusion was that we had stumbled into another coincidence of galactic diversity. Each anomaly became manageable once it was translated into coincidence. And yet, when coincidences begin to stack, they form a language of their own, a language we refuse to learn. The first principle of this language is isolation. A coincidence can only exist if each event is treated on its own. The WOW signal as a coincidence is safe, because it never repeated. Oumuamua as a coincidence is safe, because it was one object seen once and then gone. Borisov as a coincidence is safe, because it looked like a comet, even if its chemistry did not match. Atlas as a coincidence is safe, because its strange ratios and speed could still be explained as quirks of formation. But if you place them together, they no longer speak coincidence, they speak sequence, they speak design. The language of cosmic coincidence relies on our unwillingness to connect the dots. The second principle is silence. Each anomaly is brief, each one unrepeatable, and silence always follows. The silence allows coincidence to survive, because without repetition, anomalies cannot be confirmed. The WOW signal's 72 seconds vanished into silence, leaving only speculation. Oumuamua's few weeks of visibility ended in silence as it sped beyond our reach. Borisov fragmented and faded, leaving silence where its chemistry once was. Atlas passed at impossible speed, leaving it spectra and then silence. The silence convinces us that nothing happened, that each event was accidental. But when silence follows every anomaly, silence itself becomes part of the language. The third principle is familiarity. Coincidences become easier to accept when they mimic what we already know. The WOW signal was narrowband radio, a form of communication we ourselves use. Oumuamua resembled a rock, even if its behaviour was strange. Borisov resembled a comet, even if its chemistry was alien. Atlas resembled a comet as well, even if its composition and speed defied expectations. Each anomaly wore a mask of the familiar, allowing us to dismiss the unfamiliar beneath. The language of cosmic coincidence hides in the comfort of resemblance. Strange enough to notice, familiar enough to ignore. What makes this language dangerous is that it can only be spoken once. Each anomaly is a fleeting word in a sentence spread across decades. If we dismiss the word as coincidence, we lose the meaning forever. We cannot replay the WOW signal. We cannot turn back Oumuamua. We cannot reassemble Borisov. We cannot capture Atlas. Each time we reach for coincidence, we erase the message. And yet, we keep doing it, as though coincidence were the only explanation we are allowed to speak. The language of cosmic coincidence is also cumulative. One anomaly is nothing. 2 can still be chance. 3 stretch probability. 4 demand recognition. And yet, even with 4, we still fall back on coincidence, because the alternative is too heavy. To admit that anomalies across decades form a pattern is to admit that someone, or something, may be speaking to us. It is to admit that the silence is not silence at all, but punctuation. It is to admit that the universe is not indifferent, but intentional. That possibility destabilizes our frameworks, and so we avoid it. Coincidence is easier. Coincidence is safer. Coincidence requires nothing from us. But coincidences are not infinite. Probability has limits. The wow signal was at the hydrogen line, the most universal frequency imaginable. Coincidence. Oumuamua accelerated without visible outgassing. Coincidence. Borisov contained carbon monoxide in quantities beyond our comets. Coincidence. Atlas carried more carbon dioxide than water, a reversal of every comet we know, and travelled faster than anything we expected. Coincidence. Each one alone is unlikely. Together they defy the very definition of chance. And yet, we call it coincidence, as though the universe has chosen to speak in the language we invented to silence it. The danger is that we may not realise coincidence has turned into code until it is too late. The anomalies will keep passing, the silence will keep following, and each time we will choose the easier word. Coincidence, not pattern. Coincidence, not warning. Coincidence, not message. The language of cosmic coincidence is not just about anomalies. It is about us, about our unwillingness to admit that improbability accumulates into design, about our fear of acknowledging that silence can speak, that chemistry can code, that motion can signal. The language is clear, but we refuse to learn it. What if that is the test? What if the measure of intelligence is not technology, not communication, but recognition? To see when coincidence has become language, to notice when the improbable has become intentional, to admit that the universe might not be silent, but subtle. If that is the test, then we are failing. Because instead of seeing language, we are seeing accidents. Instead of reading code, we are reading coincidence. Instead of acknowledging warnings, we're ignoring them. The wow signal. Oumuamua, Borisov, Atlas. 4 words in a language that is still being written. 4 missed chances to admit that the universe might be speaking. 4 refusals to learn the grammar of anomaly. Each time we chose coincidence. Each time we erased the meaning. The language of cosmic coincidence is not written in stars, not spoken in transmissions, not etched in stone. It is written in the way we explain things away. It is spoken in our own denial. It is etched in the archives of data we refuse to connect. That is the real warning, that our greatest danger is not silence from the cosmos, but silence from ourselves. The strange thing about the anomalies is that they were never invisible. They were all recorded, measured, preserved in archives that still exist. The wow signal was written down in numbers on a printout, circled in red ink by an astronomer who knew at least for a moment what he was seeing. Oumuamua was tracked across the sky, its brightness plotted into curves that revealed a shape no one expected. Borisov's spectra were stored in files, showing ratios of carbon monoxide to water that no comet in our system carries. Atlas's chemistry was captured in detail, its overwhelming carbon dioxide locked into databases, its impossible speed calculated and confirmed. None of these events passed without evidence. None of them vanished without leaving a trace, and yet the traces have become invisible, buried not by absence, but by neglect. The warnings were hidden in the data, not because the data was unclear, but because the meaning was ignored. Data has always been the way science protects itself. A measurement is neutral, a record is safe, a table of numbers makes no claim on its own. Interpretation is what turns data into meaning, and interpretation is where we fail when the anomalies press against our comfort. The wow signal was filed as unexplained and left there. Oumuamua's acceleration was described in papers that leaned heavily on natural explanations. Borisov's chemistry was presented as diversity, not anomaly. Atlas's spectra were analysed but folded into discussions of comet formation. The data remains, untouched, but the warnings hidden within it are invisible unless someone is willing to connect them. Part of the problem is that science fragments data into categories. Radio astronomy belongs to one field, planetary astronomy to another, cometary chemistry to another. Each community studies its own anomalies in isolation. The wow signal belongs to SETI researchers, not to planetary scientists. Oumuamua belongs to small-body dynamicists, not to radio astronomers. Borisov belongs to comet specialists, not to cosmologists. Atlas belongs to chemists and spectroscopists, not to those who care about signals. Each anomaly is studied within its silo, and within the silo each one can be explained as coincidence. The warnings are hidden not in the data itself, but in the walls between disciplines that prevent the data from being seen together. Another way the warnings are hidden is through time. The wow signal happened in 1977, decades before Oumuamua. By the time Oumuamua arrived, the wow signal was a historical curiosity, remembered mostly by enthusiasts, not by the mainstream scientific community. Borisov followed quickly, but even then the connections were rarely made. Atlas arrived 6 years later, and again, the link to the earlier anomalies was not part of the mainstream conversation. The time between events allows memory to fade, and when memory fades, data loses its urgency. The warnings are still in the archives, but without memory they are just numbers, detached from their meaning. And yet, the data is precise. The wow. Signal's narrowband burst at the hydrogen line is still there, exactly as it was measured. Oumuamua's changing brightness is still plotted, still showing an elongated or flattened object that no natural category fits. Borisov's chemical ratios are still strange, still defying easy comparison. Atlas's dominance of carbon dioxide is still shocking, still unlike anything in our system. The warnings are not hidden by error. They are hidden by our refusal to see them as warnings. They are hidden by our insistence that anomalies must always reduce to the ordinary. Consider how differently we treat data in other contexts. A single unusual reading in a medical test can be enough to trigger follow-up scans, because doctors understand that anomalies may point to deeper problems. A single deviation in financial markets can lead to investigations, because investors understand that patterns matter. A single unexpected signal in cybersecurity can trigger alarms, because analysts understand that attacks often begin subtly. In all these cases, data is treated as potential warning. But in astronomy, when the data points toward intelligence or intention, we do the opposite. We smooth it out, we explain it away, we bury it under probability. The warnings are hidden not because we cannot see them, but because we will not allow ourselves to. The silence after each anomaly is part of this problem. Silence convinces us that nothing matters. The wow. Signal did not repeat, so the data is treated as noise. Oumuamua did not linger, so its acceleration is treated as coincidence. Borisov disintegrated, so its chemistry is treated as diversity. Atlas sped away, so its carbon dioxide is treated as curiosity. But silence is not absence. Silence is design. Silence is what allows the warnings to test us. If the wow signal had repeated endlessly, we would have no choice but to believe. If Oumuamua had stayed in orbit, we would have no choice but to study. If Borisov had resembled our comets perfectly, it would not have spoken. If Atlas had been water-dominated, we would have forgotten it immediately. The anomalies are warnings precisely because they resist repetition. Their singularity is the code, and the data is the key. Some researchers have noticed this. Scattered across papers, across conferences, across discussions, there are voices pointing out that the data does not add up, that Oumuamua's acceleration without outgassing remains unexplained, that Borisov's carbon monoxide ratios are extreme, that Atlas's dominance of carbon dioxide is not a trivial difference, that the wow signal remains unmatched in all of radio astronomy. These voices are often marginalized, treated as speculative, pushed to the edges of credibility, but they are reading the data as it is written. They are seeing the warnings hidden within it, and they are ignored not because they are wrong, but because their recognition demands too much. The tragedy is that the data will outlast us. The records of the wow signal will remain. The orbital calculations of Oumuamua will persist. The spectra of Borisov and Atlas will sit in databases long after the debates fade. The warnings are already preserved, waiting to be recognized. Perhaps in a future generation someone will place them side by side and see what we refuse to. Perhaps the connection will be made too late, when the next anomaly arrives and forces recognition we can no longer deny. Or perhaps the warnings will remain hidden forever, buried not by time, but by choice. The most important point is that the data is enough. We do not need new anomalies to admit what is already there. The pattern is already written. The warnings are already present. The silence between them is already meaningful. Everything we need to see is in the archives, waiting. The only question is whether we will look, whether we will allow the data to speak as loudly as it already does, because the warnings are not invisible. They were never invisible. They were simply hidden in plain sight, in the numbers we recorded, in the signals we measured, in the chemistry we analysed, in the anomalies we dismissed. The warnings are not out there in the sky. They are here, in the data, waiting for us to learn how to read them. Bias is invisible until it is tested, and the anomalies that passed through our telescopes over the last half-century tested ours in ways we were not prepared to face. The WOW signal in 1977, Oumuamua in 2017, Borisov in 2019, and Atlas in 2025 each revealed something about the cosmos, but more importantly, they revealed something about us. The numbers were clear, the detections reliable, the records preserved, but the interpretations bent around expectations we did not want to break. The warnings may have been ignored not because they were unclear, but because our own bias blinded us. The most obvious bias was naturalism. Science is built on the assumption that natural explanations must always be preferred, and in almost every case this principle serves us well. Stars, planets, comets and galaxies all obey physical laws, and invoking intelligence where nature suffices would be reckless. But bias is not about principle. It is about reflex. When the WOW signal appeared as a narrowband burst at the hydrogen line, the most universal frequency in the cosmos, the reflex was to call it interference or coincidence, even though no clear natural explanation ever emerged. When Oumuamua accelerated without visible outgassing, the reflex was to invent natural mechanisms, even if they stretched plausibility. When Borisov showed chemistry far outside our expectations, the reflex was to call it diversity, even though it was unlike anything we had seen. When Atlas inverted the ratios of cometary composition, the reflex was to fold it into natural categories, even when those categories bent under the strain. The bias was not evidence-based, it was cultural. Another bias was toward repetition. A single event, no matter how strange, was never enough. The WOW signal happened once, and therefore it meant nothing. Oumuamua was seen once, and therefore it meant nothing. Borisov and Atlas each came once, and therefore they were curiosities, not messages. Our bias tells us that if something is real, it must repeat, and if it does not, it must be noise. But what if uniqueness is the message? What if the silence after each event is intentional, a way of testing whether we are capable of recognizing significance without repetition? Our bias against singularity blinded us to that possibility. We decided that what happens once is irrelevant, and in doing so, we erased the very events that mattered most. There was also the bias of compartmentalization. The WOW signal was owned by radio astronomers and SETI researchers. Oumuamua was owned by planetary scientists. Borisov was owned by comet specialists. Atlas was owned by spectroscopists and dynamicists. Each anomaly was studied within its own field, and within its own field it could be explained away. What no one wanted to do was connect them across disciplines, because that would mean stepping outside comfort zones and admitting a larger story. Our bias towards specialization blinded us to the sequence. Each group saw one piece of the puzzle, and no one wanted to risk credibility by putting the pieces together. Skepticism itself became a bias. Healthy skepticism requires weighing evidence, but the skepticism that greeted these anomalies often went further. It dismissed extraordinary implications outright, not because evidence was lacking, but because the implications were too extraordinary. The wow signal's artificial possibility was called sensational. Oumuamua's potential technology was called unscientific. Borisov's alien chemistry was softened into diversity. Atlas's inversion of composition was downplayed as an outlier. The skepticism was not directed at the data, it was directed at the interpretations that dared to reach beyond the ordinary. This is not skepticism as a tool. It is skepticism as a shield. Cultural bias also played its part. Popular culture has filled our imagination with stories of aliens, invasions, and contact. Scientists recoil from being associated with those narratives, fearing ridicule and loss of credibility. The result is an overcorrection, where any anomaly that hints at intelligence must be explained as natural, even if the explanation does not fully fit. The fear of being wrong in the extraordinary direction blinded us to being wrong in the ordinary one. We would rather stretch natural categories until they break than risk admitting the extraordinary. That bias is not scientific, it is psychological. Even probability became a bias. When Oumuamua was discovered, some argued that the detection of the first interstellar object within a few years of new surveys was perfectly reasonable. When Borisov followed just 2 years later, probability was stretched but still accepted. When Atlas arrived in 2025, faster and stranger than either, probability was once again stretched, but coincidence was still invoked. Each time, improbability was dismissed as unremarkable, because acknowledging its weight would point toward intention. Our bias was to underestimate the significance of improbability, to treat chance as infinite, to ignore when chance itself became the anomaly. All of these biases converged into blindness. The data was there, the records were clear, the warnings were visible, but our own frameworks prevented us from seeing them. It was easier to call the wow signal interference than to admit it might be intentional. Easier to call Oumuamua natural than to admit we did not know. Easier to call Borisov diverse than to admit it was alien. Easier to call Atlas a curiosity than to admit it was code. Easier to accept coincidence than to confront design. The blindness was not in the sky, it was in us. Bias also shaped how we stored the events. Each anomaly was archived but not prioritized. The wow signal sits in old datasheets remembered mostly by enthusiasts. Oumuamua's records are filed in observational databases, studied by a shrinking circle of specialists. Borisov's spectra exist in papers, read by few. Atlas's chemistry is preserved but already fading from conversation. The warnings were recorded, but our bias ensured they would not remain urgent. They became curiosities, not alarms, because our interpretation filtered them through the lens of dismissal. The blindness was encoded into the way we remembered them. The most unsettling part of bias is that it does not feel like bias. It feels like truth. To the astronomers of 1977, it felt true that the wow signal was interference. To the researchers of 2017, it felt true that Oumuamua was a natural rock. To the comet specialists of 2019, it felt true that Borisov's chemistry was diversity. To the spectroscopists of 2025, it felt true that Atlas's carbon dioxide was a quirk. Each explanation felt safe, logical, rational. Bias disguises itself as reason, and that disguise is what blinds us most effectively. Warnings are useless if the receiver is not capable of seeing past their own filters. If these anomalies were part of a test, then the test was not about detection. We passed that easily. Our instrument saw everything. The test was about interpretation. Could we see past our own biases to recognize the warnings for what they were? The answer so far is no. The bias that blinded us ensured that the message, if there was one, passed unnoticed. We looked directly at it and saw nothing. The blindness is still with us. The warnings are still in the archives, still waiting, still clear. But until we confront the biases that prevent recognition, the next anomaly will suffer the same fate. It will be measured, recorded, explained, and forgotten. Another warning hidden by the filters we refuse to acknowledge. Another chance erased not by silence from the cosmos, but by silence within ourselves. Science is meant to be a method, not a shield. At its core, it is a process of observing, testing, refining, and questioning. Skepticism is supposed to sharpen that process, forcing every claim to be tested, every conclusion to be earned. But when faced with anomalies that challenge the deepest assumptions, skepticism sometimes shifts from tool to barrier. It becomes silence disguised as rigour, dismissal dressed as caution. That is how the wow signal was buried, how Oumuamua was softened into natural explanations, how Borisov was normalised, and how Atlas was minimised. Each event was seen clearly, each was measured carefully, each was treated with skepticism so absolute that the extraordinary possibilities were erased. The story begins with the wow signal. A narrowband burst right at the hydrogen line lasting 72 seconds, strong enough to stand out from the noise, clear enough to be recognised even by those unfamiliar with radio astronomy. It was everything a signal should be, except it never repeated. That silence was enough. Science demands repeatability, and without it, skepticism turned the wow signal into an unsolved curiosity rather than a candidate for intelligence. But the silence was not absence. The silence could have been part of the design, a deliberate scarcity meant to test whether we could recognise meaning in a single chance. Instead, silence became the reason it was forgotten. 4 decades later, Oumuamua passed through. The data showed a shape we had never seen before, tumbling in a way no asteroid had been observed to tumble, reflecting light in patterns that suggested an object 10 times longer than wide, or else a flat, disc-like form. As it left the sun, it accelerated slightly more than gravity could account for, without producing a visible tail. These were extraordinary observations, and extraordinary observations sometimes demand extraordinary explanations. But skepticism leaned toward naturalism because to admit the artificial was to step into dangerous territory. Radiation pressure, exotic ices, invisible jets. Hypotheses were proposed that stretched credibility, but they had the advantage of being natural. Skepticism chose them over the extraordinary. The silence that followed Oumuamua was not in the data but in the conclusions. A harbinger turned into a rock. Borisov in 2019 was easier to contain. It looked like a comet. It behaved like a comet. And it reassured scientists who were uneasy about Oumuamua's strangeness. Its hyperbolic orbit made it undeniably interstellar, but its visible coma made it easy to frame as familiar. And yet, its chemistry spoke differently. Carbon monoxide dominated in quantities no comet in our system carried. Ratios that suggested an origin in colder alien conditions, warnings hidden in the spectrum, but skepticism treated this as diversity, not anomaly. A coincidence of formation, not a message in chemistry. Silence again, this time behind the comfort of familiarity. Atlas in 2025 pushed harder, faster than Oumuamua, older than Earth, dominated by carbon dioxide in a way no comet in our solar system was. The data was unambiguous. The strangeness could not be denied. But skepticism still found a way to file it into the ordinary. Altered surfaces, galactic variants, unknown natural mechanisms, explanations that carried no direct evidence, but carried the comfort of normalcy. The chemistry that looked like code was treated as chance. The velocity that suggested urgency was treated as happenstance. The warning that should have been obvious was ignored again. Skepticism had succeeded not in clarifying truth, but in preserving silence. This pattern reveals something deeper about the way science handles anomalies. Repeatability and natural explanations are the default requirements, but when anomalies are singular, when they resist replication, they are discarded rather than pursued. The wow signal was never heard again, so it meant nothing. Oumuamua was never seen again, so it meant nothing. Borisov disintegrated, so it meant nothing. Atlas passed and vanished, so it meant nothing. Each anomaly was treated as insufficient because it refused to conform to the framework science prefers. Skepticism erased them, not because the data was weak, but because the data was too strong in the wrong direction. Silence is the result of that erasure. The wow signal became a historical curiosity, brought up in documentaries but not in research. Oumuamua was remembered as strange but ultimately natural, even though no consensus explanation ever fit. Borisov was remembered as diversity in comet chemistry, even though it broke the limits of what diversity should mean. Atlas is already fading into memory, its data archived but its meaning avoided. Each anomaly produced an initial burst of debate, then skepticism, then silence. That silence is not the absence of anomalies, it is the absence of recognition. The irony is that skepticism is not evenly applied. When natural explanations are weak, they are still accepted because they fit our comfort zone. Radiation pressure acting on Oumuamua without evidence of a thin sheet. Invisible jets that left no trace. Cometary diversity that extends far beyond anything we've observed locally. These explanations were not repeatable, not confirmed, not strongly evidenced, but they were natural, and that was enough. Skepticism bends when it points toward the ordinary, but hardens when it points toward the extraordinary. This imbalance reveals the bias at its core. Science and skepticism together have built our greatest achievements. They have carried us to the moon, revealed black holes, mapped the genome, expanded our understanding of the universe. But the same tools that uncover truth can also blind us to it. The insistence on repeatability, the preference for natural explanations, the fear of extraordinary implications, all of these combine to ensure that the sequence of anomalies across decades remained fragmented and muted. The wow signal was extraordinary. Oumuamua was extraordinary. Borisov was extraordinary. Atlas was extraordinary. Science recorded all of them. Skepticism buried them. Silence covered what remained. If the warnings are real, then this pattern is devastating. It means that even when the message is delivered directly into our instruments, even when the data is clean and undeniable, we will not recognize it. Not because we lack the technology, but because we lack the willingness. The warning is not about what the cosmos is saying. The warning is about how we listen. If silence follows every anomaly, then the silence is ours. But even silence is data. The absence of follow-up, the refusal to connect, the dismissal of the extraordinary, all of this is part of the story. It reveals how unprepared we are to face messages that do not fit our frameworks. It reveals how fragile our recognition systems are. It reveals how warnings can be given clearly, in multiple forms across decades, and still pass unnoticed. Science remains powerful, skepticism remains necessary, but both can be turned into walls. And when walls rise, silence follows. The anomalies are still in the record. The wow signal remains written in the numbers. Oumuamua's light curve still shows a shape that refuses to fit. Borisov's spectra still tell of alien chemistry. Atlas's carbon dioxide ratios still break the mould. The data is still there. The warnings are still there. But unless skepticism is used as a tool instead of a shield, unless science is willing to look at patterns instead of fragments, the silence will continue. The next anomaly will be treated the same way. The same debates, the same dismissals, the same fading into quiet. Another warning delivered, another warning ignored. The story of interstellar visitors begins with objects, but it never ends there. Rocks, comets, fragments of ice, bursts of radio static. At first glance they are things, measurable and neutral, passing through the solar system like countless others before them. But each anomaly carried with it more than physical presence. The wow signal was not simply a burst of radio noise. Oumuamua was not simply a shard of rock. Borisov was not simply a comet. Atlas was not simply chemistry in motion. Each one shifted under scrutiny, becoming something larger, something symbolic. They became omens, not because they were supernatural, but because their timing, their strangeness, and their silence transformed them from objects into messages. The shift begins with perception. An object is easy to measure, but an omen is interpreted. When the Big Ear telescope recorded the wow signal in 1977, it was logged as data. But when Jerry Amon circled the numbers and wrote wow in the margin, the object became omen. A narrowband burst at the hydrogen line is physical fact, but the recognition of its significance is what made it more. It was not just a signal, it was a moment of wonder, a suggestion of intelligence, a hint of something beyond. That interpretation turned it into a warning, even if no one admitted it at the time. The same shift happened with Oumuamua. For a few weeks in 2017, the world watched as astronomers debated what it was. Its shape defied categories, its acceleration resisted explanation, its silence in emissions challenged expectations. The numbers could be treated as ordinary, but the unease around them transformed Oumuamua into something else. To some, it became the first harbinger, the first physical messenger from beyond. To others, it became a reminder of how fragile our confidence is. Either way, it became omen. Its passage through the solar system was more than transit. It was a mirror, forcing us to confront what we were willing to consider. Borisov, discovered in 2019, followed the same path. At first it reassured. It had a tail, a coma, jets of gas, features that made it familiar, but its chemistry, rich in carbon monoxide in a way our comets never are, reminded us that familiarity can conceal difference. It became omen in the same way comets have always been omen, not because of superstition, but because they arrived carrying strangeness from elsewhere. Ancient civilizations once saw comets as harbingers of change, as signs written across the sky. Borisov fit that archetype perfectly. It was comet-like, but alien. It was stranger in both name and nature. Its data could be measured, but its meaning was heavier than numbers alone. And then Atlas in 2025. Faster than any visitor before it, older than Earth itself, dominated by carbon dioxide instead of water, moving too quickly for comfort. The data was extraordinary, but what made it omen was the way it slotted into the sequence. After the wow signal, after Oumuamua, after Borisov, Atlas was impossible to treat as isolated. Its speed, its chemistry, its age, all of them carried symbolic weight. It was a relic of ancient galactic history, a messenger from before our solar system existed. When people looked at Atlas, they did not just see a comet. They saw a warning. The omen was not in the object. The omen was in the context. From object to omen, the transformation happens in the space between data and meaning. An object is numbers, trajectories, spectra. An omen is interpretation, connection, consequence. The warning emerges not from the physical body itself, but from what it represents. The wow signal represented the possibility of contact. Oumuamua represented the possibility of technology. Borisov represented the possibility of alien chemistry. Atlas represented the possibility of design. Each one carried weight beyond its measurable features, weight that transformed it into something more than object. This transformation is not unique to astronomy. Humanity has always turned objects into omens. Eclipses were once seen as signs of divine anger. Comets were seen as warnings of disaster. Unusual stars were seen as portents of change. We no longer frame them in supernatural terms, but the instinct remains. Anomalies demand interpretation, and interpretation shapes meaning. The difference now is that the anomalies are not imagined. They are measured, recorded, undeniable. The data is real, and the omen is what we make of it. The danger is that by treating anomalies only as objects, we strip them of their warning. The wow signal reduced to noise, Oumuamua reduced to rock, Borisov reduced to diversity, Atlas reduced to quirk. Each time we stripped away the omen and left only the object. Each time the warning was ignored because the data alone seemed insufficient. But data is never enough on its own. Meaning emerges in connection, and connection is what we refuse to make. By refusing, we protect ourselves from consequence. By refusing, we blind ourselves to the possibility that the anomalies are not random. If the anomalies are deliberate, then their transformation into omens is part of the design. A narrowband signal at hydrogen, a tumbling shape with unexplained motion, a comet with alien chemistry, another with inverted ratios and impossible speed, each one carries symbolic weight. Each one forces us to confront what we are willing to believe. Each one tests whether we can see more than object, whether we can recognize omen. The silence that follows each event is the final piece of that test. The silence asks whether the warning survives when the object is gone. Atlas was perhaps the clearest omen of all. Its chemistry was code, its speed urgency, its age authority. It was not simply an interstellar rock. It was a relic older than Earth, passing through our system as if to remind us of how young we are, how fragile, how temporary. It was omen because it represented scale. Galactic scale, cosmic scale, time scales beyond imagination. To see Atlas was to see our place in something larger. To ignore Atlas was to ignore that message. From object to omen, the shift is subtle but critical. It is not about proof, not about certainty, not about declaring contact. It is about recognition. Recognition that some anomalies carry weight beyond their data. Recognition that objects can be messengers. Recognition that the universe may not speak in repetition, but in rarity. Recognition that silence can be design. The objects have already passed, their warnings left behind. The question is whether we treat them as omens or curiosities. So far we have chosen the latter, and in that choice the warnings remain unanswered. The question has always lingered in the background of these anomalies, unspoken but unavoidable. What happens if they were signals and we ignored them? What is the cost of turning warnings into curiosities, of burying messages under the language of coincidence, of refusing to see patterns when they are drawn directly in front of us? The wow signal, Oumuamua, Borisov, and Atlas each carried something strange, something that did not fit, something that demanded attention. But instead of treating them as potential communication, we treated them as data points, logged, analysed, archived, and eventually forgotten. The cost of ignoring signals is not just scientific, it is existential. At the simplest level, the cost is knowledge. If the wow signal was intentional, then we had direct evidence of intelligence beyond Earth nearly half a century ago. That would have been the single most important discovery in human history, a confirmation that we are not alone, that the universe is not silent. But because it did not repeat, we dismissed it, and the moment passed. If Oumuamua was more than rock, if its shape and acceleration were intentional, then we ignored the first technological artifact ever observed crossing our solar system. If Borisov's chemistry was not just diversity but code, then we ignored a message written in ratios, delivered by ice. If Atlas's speed and composition were deliberate, then we ignored the clearest signal yet, the loudest anomaly, the one that should have forced recognition. The cost is that the discovery of a lifetime may already have happened, and we refuse to claim it. But the cost goes deeper. Ignoring signals also shapes how we prepare for the future. If the wow signal had been taken seriously, SETI might have been funded at levels that matched its potential. If Oumuamua had been recognised as extraordinary, we might have built faster missions, new telescopes, new instruments to intercept the next one. If Borisov had been seen as more than diversity, we might have shifted our models of planetary formation and prioritised the study of interstellar comets. If Atlas had been treated as a deliberate warning, we might have restructured our priorities entirely. Instead, each event left only a ripple, too small to shift our course. The cost is readiness. When the next anomaly arrives, we will be no more prepared than we were in 1977, despite half a century of evidence. The cost also lies in trust. Science asks the public to believe that anomalies are investigated without bias, that evidence is followed wherever it leads. But when extraordinary data is softened into ordinary conclusions, that trust erodes. People sense the hesitation, the unwillingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities. When scientists dismiss anomalies with explanations that fit poorly, the silence becomes obvious. That silence creates suspicion, and suspicion breeds mistrust. The cost is credibility. By ignoring signals, science risks losing the very authority it needs to face whatever comes next. There is a deeper cost, harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. It is the cost of failing a test we did not know we were taking. If the anomalies are intentional, then they may be part of a sequence designed to measure recognition. Can a young civilization notice patterns spread across decades? Can it interpret chemistry as code, silence as design, speed as urgency? If the answer is no, then the signals may stop, the sequence may end, the opportunity may be lost forever. The cost is not just ignorance, the cost is exclusion. To ignore warnings is to fail the very test that determines whether we are worth speaking to. History shows us what happens when warnings are ignored. Civilizations collapse not only because of disasters, but because they refuse to read the signs in front of them. Environmental collapse, economic instability, political fractures, all of them come with signals, early signs, anomalies that do not fit the pattern. When ignored, they grow into catastrophe. The cosmos may work the same way. The wow signal was an early sign. Oumuamua was another. Borisov added to the list. Atlas made it undeniable. Each one was a flare in the dark, an anomaly that said pay attention. Ignoring them carries the same cost as ignoring any warning. Consequences that cannot be reversed. The cost may not be immediate. Nothing destroyed us when we ignored the wow signal. Nothing ended civilization when we explained away Oumuamua. Nothing collapsed when we minimized Borisov. Nothing changed when Atlas sped past. But that is how warnings work. They do not destroy on their own. They prepare. They test. They give us the chance to act before it is too late. The absence of disaster does not mean the absence of danger. It means the warning period is still active. The cost of ignoring signals is paid later, when the silence ends, when the anomaly is no longer just anomaly, when the consequences arrive and we realize too late that we were told. There is also the cost of perspective. The wow signal should have forced us to admit that communication may not come in repetition. Oumuamua should have forced us to admit that technology may not look like technology. Borisov should have forced us to admit that alien chemistry may not match our categories. Atlas should have forced us to admit that urgency can be written into speed. Each anomaly should have expanded our frameworks. By ignoring them, our frameworks remain narrow, fragile, incapable of accommodating the extraordinary. The cost is blindness, built into the very tools we trust to see. And then there is the symbolic cost. When we call the wow signal coincidence, we diminish wonder. When we call Oumuamua natural, we diminish curiosity. When we call Borisov diversity, we diminish strangeness. When we call Atlas a quirk, we diminish warning. The anomalies lose their power, not because they are understood, but because they are dismissed. We rob ourselves of meaning. We erase the chance to ask bigger questions. The cost is cultural as much as scientific. It is the loss of imagination, the loss of urgency, the loss of recognition that the universe might already be speaking. The cost of ignoring signals is not abstract. It is recorded in our priorities, in our institutions, in our readiness. We continue to search for life on exoplanets, to look for biosignatures in distant atmospheres, to listen for radio transmissions from the stars. But when signals arrive here, when objects pass directly through our solar system, when chemistry itself speaks in ratios that should not exist, we turn away. The contradiction is stark. We are prepared to spend decades searching distant systems, but not to admit what is already in front of us. The cost is opportunity lost twice, once in the sky, once in ourselves. The next anomaly will come, that much is certain. The galaxy is full of objects, and interstellar visitors will continue to pass through. Signals may flare again, briefly, unexpectedly. Data will accumulate, records will be stored, debates will repeat. The question is whether the cost will be paid again. Will the next warning join the others in the archive of curiosities? Or will we finally admit that 4 extraordinary anomalies in half a century are not coincidence but message? The answer will determine whether the cost continues to grow, whether the silence remains ours, whether the warnings remain ignored. Preparing for the next visitor should not be complicated, and yet it is. The lessons are already in front of us. The wow. Signal taught us that communication can be brief and unrepeatable. Oumuamua taught us that physical objects can move in ways that do not conform to categories. Borisov taught us that chemistry can signal strangeness. Atlas taught us that speed and composition together can carry urgency. 4 anomalies, 4 lessons, spread across decades. If we were willing to admit what they mean, we would know exactly how to prepare. But because we explained them away, because we treated them as curiosities instead of messages, we remain almost as unprepared as we were before any of them happened. Preparation begins with recognition. The first step is admitting that anomalies matter, even when they occur once, even when they resist repetition, even when they fall outside familiar frameworks. If the next visitor arrives and displays even one feature that does not fit, we must be ready to treat that anomaly as significant rather than smoothing it into coincidence. That requires a cultural shift within science, a willingness to allow singular events to carry weight. Without that, the next signal, the next object, the next comet will be filed away as just another curiosity. Recognition is the foundation. Without it, preparation is impossible. The second step is infrastructure. Oumuamua passed too quickly for us to launch any mission, and by the time proposals were made, it was already gone. Atlas moved even faster, leaving almost no chance for direct study. If we are serious about preparation, we need systems ready to launch on short notice, capable of intercepting interstellar objects before they vanish. We need telescopes dedicated to early detection, surveys that can spot anomalies far in advance, instruments that can collect detailed data without delay. Preparing for the next visitor means treating these events not as rare accidents, but as inevitable occurrences that deserve priority. The galaxy is full of debris. Visitors will come again. The only question is whether we are ready when they do. The third step is openness. The warnings we ignored were not hidden by lack of data, but by bias. If the next visitor carries chemistry that does not fit, or motion that defies explanation, or silence that feels deliberate, we must allow the extraordinary possibility to stand beside the natural ones. That does not mean abandoning skepticism. It means balancing it. It means admitting that the extraordinary is sometimes the correct interpretation. Preparing for the next visitor requires more than instruments. It requires a mindset willing to face what the data actually says, even when it threatens our assumptions. There is also the matter of memory. The timeline of anomalies stretches back nearly 50 years, but memory is fragile. Each generation of scientists inherits only fragments, often filtered through dismissals. The wow signal is treated as trivia, not as lesson. Oumuamua is remembered as strange, but softened into naturalism. Borisov is filed as comet diversity. Atlas is already fading into the archives. Preparing for the next visitor means carrying memory forward, not allowing anomalies to be erased by silence. It means teaching that singular events can matter, that patterns can be spread across decades, that the past 4 warnings are not curiosities but part of a story. Without memory, every anomaly looks isolated. With memory, they form sequence. The next visitor may not look like the ones before. It may not be a comet. It may not be a rock. It may not be a burst of radio. It may arrive in a form we have not imagined, carrying data in ways we do not yet understand. That is part of the preparation too. Expecting the unexpected, allowing for forms of communication that do not fit our templates, recognizing that the universe may not speak in repetition but in escalation. If the anomalies we have seen are messages, then the next one may not repeat them. It may raise the stakes, alter the channel, shift the method. We must be prepared to recognize not just what we have seen, but what we have not yet seen. This preparation extends beyond astronomy. If the signals are real, they are not just for scientists, they are for humanity. That means building systems of interpretation that cross fields, linking radio astronomy with planetary science, chemistry with dynamics, astrophysics with cultural analysis. The warnings we ignored were missed in part because each discipline held its own peace and refused to connect them. Preparing for the next visitor means breaking those walls, treating anomalies as cross-disciplinary events that demand collective interpretation. Only then can we hope to see the pattern when it emerges. There is also the question of response. If the next anomaly is undeniable, what will we do? Will we treat it as discovery, as warning, as challenge? Will we prepare to send messages of our own, or will we remain silent, hoping not to draw attention? Preparation is not just about detection, it is about decision. The wow signal asked if we would answer. Oumuamua asked if we would pursue. Borisov asked if we would compare. Atlas asked if we would recognize. Each time our answer was silence. If the next visitor comes, we must be ready not just to observe, but to decide what silence means and whether it should continue. Preparing for the next visitor also means confronting fear. Fear of ridicule, fear of consequence, fear of what recognition implies. The cost of ignoring signals has always been rooted in fear. The fear that extraordinary claims will destroy credibility. But fear is not preparation. Fear is paralysis. The next anomaly will not wait for us to be comfortable. It will arrive, it will be measured, and it will vanish. Preparation means being ready to move through fear, to treat the data with honesty even when it points toward unsettling truths. None of this is hypothetical. The next visitor is coming. Interstellar objects pass through the galaxy constantly, and as our instruments improve, we will see more of them. Another burst of radio, another tumbling rock, another comet with alien chemistry. Something will arrive, and soon. The timeline is too compact, the sequence too clear to think otherwise. We are not waiting centuries. We are waiting years, perhaps less. The next visitor will come, and when it does, the test will repeat. Recognition, infrastructure, openness, memory, interpretation, response, courage. These are the tools we need. Without them, the next warning will be ignored just like the last. Preparation is not about certainty. It is about possibility. The wow signal may not have been intentional. Oumuamua may have been natural. Borisov may have been diversity. Atlas may have been chance. But even if all 4 were coincidences, the preparation they demand is still the same. To treat anomalies as significant, to build systems ready to act, to carry memory forward, to remain open to the extraordinary. Because if even one of them was signal, then everything changes. And if the next one is undeniable, we cannot afford to be caught unprepared again. The visitors will keep coming, the warnings will keep arriving. The only question is whether we are ready to hear them. The story of Three-Eye Atlas and the anomalies before it does not end in the sky. It ends in us. 4 extraordinary events stretched across half a century, each of them fleeting, each of them undeniable, each of them reduced into curiosity by the way we chose to frame them. The wow signal was circled on a printout and then abandoned to archives. Oumuamua slid across the solar system like a stone skipping water and left debates that softened into silence. Borisov broke apart in a way that revealed chemistry alien to our system, but was softened into variety. Atlas burned through with speed and composition that should have shattered our categories, yet was folded into the ordinary. The echo's not in the cosmos, it is in us, repeating the same mistake, ignoring the same warnings, erasing the same message each time. That echo never fades because we have not changed. The echo begins with silence. Every anomaly was brief. Every anomaly vanished. Every anomaly left us with numbers instead of certainty. Silence became the thread connecting them. Silence became the excuse for dismissal. Silence became the reason we could file them away as coincidence. But silence is not nothing. Silence is design. Silence is punctuation. Silence is what makes fleeting things matter. A message repeated endlessly is noise. A message spoken once is test. The wow signal lasted 72 seconds, and the silence that followed is its other half. Oumuamua's weeks of tumbling light were followed by endless silence, and that silence was as much part of its meaning as the object itself. Borisov's alien chemistry faded into silence, leaving absence where there had once been anomaly. Atlas came with impossible velocity, leaving silence almost before we had time to measure. Each silence was treated as absence. Each silence was actually echo. The echo is also in the pattern. Alone, the wow. Signal could be dismissed. Alone, Oumuamua could be explained. Alone, Borisov could be softened. Alone, Atlas could be treated as quirk. Together they form sequence, escalation, story. 4 anomalies across 50 years, 4 warnings stacked one after another, each in a different channel, each adding weight. The echo is in that repetition, not literal repetition of the same form, but repetition of strangeness, repetition of singularity, repetition of silence. It is the same message spoken in different languages, waiting to see if we are capable of learning. The echo never fades because the pattern is still visible. It will remain visible as long as the records remain, as long as someone is willing to place them side by side and read them as they were written. The echo also lingers in the data itself. The wow signal still sits in files, clean and sharp, a burst that has never been matched. Oumuamua's light curves still show an object that defied natural categories, acceleration without explanation. Borisov's spectra still show ratios that make no sense within solar system formation. Atlas's records still contain chemistry that reverses everything we know about comets. None of this data has decayed. None of it has disappeared. It sits waiting, still as true now as the day it was recorded. That is what makes the echo eternal. The anomalies may be gone, but the warnings are preserved in evidence that does not change. Ignoring them does not erase them. Silence does not destroy them. They remain, echoing through the archives, waiting to be recognized. The echo extends beyond science. It seeps into culture, into imagination, into the way we think about the cosmos. People still bring up the wow, signal in discussions of alien life. Oumuamua still haunts speculation about technology. Borisov is still cited as proof that interstellar comets exist, even if its chemistry is ignored. Atlas may not yet have left its cultural mark, but it will, because its strangeness is too sharp to be forgotten. These anomalies shape the way we imagine our place in the universe, whether scientists admit it or not. The echoes in conversation, in curiosity, in the quiet sense that something extraordinary has already brushed past us and we let it go. That feeling does not fade. It persists, waiting to be spoken aloud. The echo also has a warning embedded within it. If these anomalies are part of a message, then the repetition across decades is deliberate. If we ignore them all, the echo may end not because it fades, but because it stops. If these were tests, we may have already failed. The wow signal asked if we would notice. Oumuamua asked if we would investigate. Borisov asked if we would connect. Atlas asked if we would recognize. Each time our answer was silence. If intelligence was speaking, then perhaps the silence we fear is the silence we earned. The echo that never fades may be the echo of our refusal, repeating louder than the messages themselves. But the echo can also be opportunity. The data is still here, the pattern is still visible, the anomalies are still recorded, we can still admit what we refuse to see. The wow signal can still be treated as possible contact. Oumuamua can still be treated as possible artifact. Borisov can still be treated as alien in its chemistry. Atlas can still be treated as code. Nothing prevents us from reinterpreting the evidence. The warnings may have been ignored in the moment, but they have not been erased. The echo remains, waiting for recognition. If the next anomaly arrives, the echo will be there too, reminding us that we've already been tested, that we already had the chance, that this time we must not fail. In the end, the echo is a mirror. It reflects not the cosmos, but ourselves. It reflects our caution, our fear, our refusal. It reflects the way we explain away what we cannot explain. It reflects the way we silence ourselves in the face of the extraordinary. It reflects the way warnings pass us by, not because they are unclear, but because we are unwilling. The echo that never fades is not theirs, it is ours. It is the repetition of missed chances, the chorus of ignored warnings, the silence we wrapped around anomalies that should have changed everything. It will not fade, because the records will not fade, because the memory will not fade, because the consequences of ignoring signals will not fade. The wow signal, Oumuamua, Borisov, Atlas. 4 anomalies, 4 messages, 4 warnings. Objects turned into omens, data turned into silence, science turned into dismissal. The echo remains, still speaking, still waiting, still refusing to be erased. It is the echo of warnings ignored, the echo of signals dismissed, the echo of chances lost. It is the echo that never fades, because until we recognize it, it will remain with us, reminding us that we were told, that we were shown, that we chose not to listen.